Hey, you never did tell me who recruited you, Neil.
Haven't you guessed by now? You did.
You've known me for years.
For me, I think this is the end of a beautiful friendship.
But for me, it's just the beginning.
We get up to some stuff. You're gonna love it. You'll see.
Some people say they don't understand Tenet. Some people say they don't understand everything in Tenet, some of it. Do you understand everything in Tenet?
You're not meant to understand everything in Tenet. It's not all comprehensible. I have to have my idea of it for it to be a valid, productive ambiguity. But the point of it is it's an ambiguity.
I'm Erik Voss, and this is The Deep Dive. I didn't understand Tenet. I put hours into decoding the timeline and the character paths. I've rewatched and rewatched sequences until they make sense. I've even translated phrases into their phonetic inverses. For example, might but stay what a sith. This with But as soon as I step away from this movie, and then I try to mentally return to it, whoosh, none of that logic math has stuck because I have not used it anywhere else in my life in the meantime. Yet, I still love this movie. I feel uneasy loving it, despite not understanding it. Does that make me a Christopher Nolan apologist? A cinema masochist? Probably yes, and probably yes. But I think I finally began to figure out why Nolan made Tenet after watching Oppenheimer, who gets referenced in Tenet.
You're familiar with the Manhattan Project? As they approached the first atomic test, Oppenheimer became concerned that the detonation might produce a chain reaction engulfing the world.
Now, Nolan did dish with Stephen Colbert about the link between these two films, and really all of his films.
Every time I make a film, I try to put I try to leave each film with interesting questions. I had the reference in Tenet because that moment leading up to the Trinity test, the idea that they sat in a room, well, when we push this button, it's possible, might end everything. We used it as an analogy in Tenet as a way into exploring a science fiction conceit.
This is why on this channel I reversed time to analyze Oppenheimer first and then go back to Tenet. Nolan's feelings about J. Robert Oppenheimer's fateful decision will be our roadmap as we revisit Tenet as a story that tries to reconcile the dread that the instrument of our own annihilation is permanently entombed under our feet, sending us spinning madly through mental loops as we race to reseal the lid of Pandora's box. So join me as we dive deep into Tenet. The film opens with the Warner logo in red, followed by Nolan's production company Syncope in blue to represent the alternating red versus blue color scheme of the two directions of time that this movie flows in. Nolan and his composer Ludwig Göransson even clue us into blue being the reverse time by reversing the score when we first see Syncope. But the music we are really hearing is a symphony at the Kiev Opera House warming up. Of course, they didn't shoot this in Kiev. They shot this in Tallinn, Estonia, at Linna Hall, a venue originally built for the 1980 Moscow Olympics when Estonia was still part of the Soviet Union, thus the brutalist architecture. Opera is one of the 5 words of the Satyr Square, from which Christopher Nolan derived the palindromic title of Tenet, Satyr, Arepo, Tenet, Opera, Rotas. All words factor into the plot of this film in some way. The Satyr Square was discovered in ruins at various Roman-era sites in Europe, Asia, and North Africa, with a cryptic meaning. Some historians believing it's a Greek cross translating to Pater Noster, the Lord's Prayer, with A and O symbolizing the Alpha and the Omega to early Christians. But since the earliest dated Satyr Square was found in Pompeii from pre-62 AD, before Christians had gotten there, some believe it was a Roman word puzzle. And you can imagine someone like Christopher Nolan looking at this and be like, did time travelers place it there by reversing an object through time to get there? One can see how a relic surviving through history would be of deep importance to Nolan while breaking the story, but I find it fascinating that the Satyr Square is never mentioned and never shown in this movie. Like every other screenwriter who stumbles upon a historical curiosity cannot wait to have some character expo dump some textbook transcription to sound authoritative. For example, Archimedes' Antikythera from Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny. But Nolan just leaves the Satyr Square in his research footnotes and doesn't bog down the viewer by repeating everything that he stumbled upon upon in his research that inspired him. Now, you can watch this whole opening scene and even read Christopher Nolan's screenplay several times like I did and still not fully understand what the hell is going on here. So for this video, let's just break down what literally is happening. Jefferson Hall plays an American spy, making contact with a Ukrainian general in an opera booth to obtain what he thinks is plutonium-241, but is actually a piece of this movie's algorithm. That spy has been exposed, and now armed militants are taking siege of this entire opera house, planning to kill various hostages to cover what they really want to do, take out this spy. Now, Nolan has not admitted to this, but this siege is based on the 2002 Nord-Ost siege at Moscow's Dubrovka Theater by Chechen terrorists, in which Russian security services released sleeping gas and stormed the building, killing all 40 hostage takers, but also tragically, 132 of the actual hostages died, many of them just due to effects of the gas. So Christopher Nolan, who grew up loving the 007 films and always dreamed of one day making an international espionage film of his own, is now reimagining that tragic event as what if the whole siege was really designed to cover the execution of an American spy, and that's why it was done so sloppily and security forces were okay with some of these hostages dying. In the world of spycraft and espionage, for intelligence services to admit they know an adversary is a spy would sometimes mean exposing how they learned that information and cutting ties with one of their own valuable assets in the field who acquired that information for them. So that could be why they'd have to mask this killing of Jefferson Hall's character as just some unrelated terrorist incident. John David Washington plays the protagonist. That's all he's ever named in this movie and in the script. He's part of a CIA unit who learns that this is going down, so they go in disguised as SWAT officers with CORD, that's Ukraine's National Police Rapid Response Unit, to extract the spy and the package, but to do this without those wanting to kill him knowing that they extracted him and thinking that they successfully killed the spy. But this whole complicated little scheme is essentially the mission of the final battle, to extract the completed algorithm, but to still let the detonation go off so that the people in the future still think it went off as planned and then don't get worried and take any measures to alter their plans. And appropriately, in this movie's timeline, the Opera House siege is taking place on the 14th and is literally occurring on the same day as the battle at Stultz 12. Now initially, this extraction plan works. Protagonist gets to the spy in the booth and gets him to safety, and he gets to the package by doing this really cool slide move under the countertop. But things get complicated when the protagonist finds these bombs being planted by other SWAT officers around the venue. What's going on here? This tells him that there must be an additional hostile rogue third party in the mix here, and he suspects his drivers who got him there might have a few different teams in the field. So he alters the exit plan. He has a spy swap clothes with one of his own guys, and he sends the spy off with a package, and he goes to collect the bombs to save the lives of all these innocent concert goers. While doing this, something even weirder happens. He's saved by a mysterious figure with a talisman on his pack who reverses a bullet from a bullet hole through one of these rogue SWAT agents who's about to kill the protagonist. We'll learn what this is, of course. Protagonist tosses the bomb in the empty booth so that the third-party bombers still think the bomb went off in the booth where they think the spy would be. But the drivers immediately know that this extracted spy was a decoy, so they shoot him in the kneecaps and they take him to a train yard to torture them. These drivers, part of the third-party SWAT bombers, we later realize must be part of Sater's crew. They knew the spy would be there with the piece of the algorithm because they have already looped back to this moment from the future. Okay, that's I think everything that happens in the opening scene, right? I feel like I just broke down one of the most complicated episodes of like an HBO show, and we're only in like the first 10 minutes of the movie. Yes, this is way too complicated for any movie's opening scene. Nolan has no qualms throwing us completely in the deep end. I think it's just because this guy has seen every 007 movie, and this is the only way a brain like Christopher Nolan's feels satisfied to structure an espionage scene without getting bored for himself. He doesn't realize that for us, we're okay with a much less complicated opening scene. But for Christopher Nolan, there must be multiple layers of crossing and double crossing and triple crossing with rogue factions several chess moves ahead through time, standing by to steal the bacon at the right moment or to make sure the bacon gets into the right hands. Okay, so now that we know what is happening in the scene, let's actually go through it to appreciate just some really cool attention to detail. The piece of the opening moments of an orchestra warming up, which we as an audience are accustomed to hearing at the beginning of a show like an overture, is violently interrupted when the conductor is shot. Yes, I heard the gunfire the first few times I saw this movie. I didn't realize until now they're shooting the poor conductor. It feels like such a crime to silence the artists who just want to bring music into the world, but I think there might be more to this, because Tenet was the first time Nolan shifted composers. He was a longtime collaborator with Hans Zimmer, but for Tenet, he switched to Ludwig Göransson, who had just won the Oscar for Black Panther and would later win again for Oppenheimer, and I think it was a brilliant choice for this movie. I don't think opening by offing the conductor was a slight against Hans Zimmer. If anything, Nolan spared Zimmer from having to score this tedious mindfuck of a movie, but it's a signal to the audience that this movie is going to have a whole new sound to it. We have to note that the protagonist's group of CIA agents were already there before the Cord SWAT drives up, as they knew that this would be happening. Protagonist flips a bullet out of his sidearm and catches it, which later sets up his reverse catching of the bullet in the lab with Clémence Possy's character, as protagonist's unit blends in with the other Ukrainian SWAT. In this shot, Nolan keeps John David Washington's mask unfogged, and he uses these curved overhead lights to direct our eye to our focal character. You can see him learning lots of lessons from his past movies where he would just frustratingly put characters in masks. He knows how to direct our eye to the hero in other ways. Protagonist greets the spy, Jefferson Hall, who plays Chevalier in Oppenheimer, with this unique exchange.
We live in a twilight world.
And there are no friends at dusk.
A twilight world. Of course, Robert Pattinson is in this film, but really it's Nolan's way of saying we live in a world constantly on the brink of extinction, and as soon as that sun dips beneath the horizon, twilight transitions to dusk. So all friendship and humanity would be gone at this point, but right now, in twilight, you still have a friend. In me. This also, in a really fun way, continues Christopher Nolan's motif of the stages of the night and how the presence or the absence of light represents hope versus despair, like in The Dark Knight.
The night is darkest just before the dawn.
Or in Interstellar.
The gravity's so strong, it's always hidden in darkness, behind the horizon. That's why we call it a black hole.
Okay, but if we see beyond the horizon,
We can't cope.
There's some things that aren't meant to be known.
Now, when one of his fellow operatives saves him from the rogue SWAT bomber, he says this.
no friends at dusk, huh? You'll do.
Which sets up moments later, Neil saving protagonist by reversing the bullet. Neil is a friend at dusk from a place beyond the horizon that protagonist cannot yet see. Protagonist meets the others in the utility room.
I've never seen encapsulation like this.
We don't know how old it is, but it's the real deal.
Now, protagonist assumes that this is a shell containing plutonium-241, but the spy says that it's the real deal because he probably scanned it with a Geiger counter and thought that it contained radioactive material, when in reality, it would only be radioactive because the pieces of these algorithms were hidden in radioactive hotspots by people in the future. Protagonist finds the last bomb.
We don't have to kill these people.
And we focus on the talisman hanging from the pack, which the end of the film will use to confirm this mystery savior as Neil. I thought this was just like a washer, but it's actually a coin from British India in 1943. And the orange and red thread that connects it to the pack is also from India. It's commonly wrapped around the wrists of theists for religious purposes. So logically, what must have happened here is Neil performed his own miniature temporal pincer. There must have been another version of Neil from the other side reversing through this chaotic shootout who shot this bullet into the floorboard to set it up for Neil to now reverse it through the guy. Does it make total sense for him to do that instead of just looping back to this battle in one direction and shooting him unidirectionally? Not really, but it looks really cool and it establishes the visual concept of reverse entropy in this film. So protagonist is taken to the train yard where Nolan frames him in the middle of one train going up the tracks and another train moving in the opposite direction, the way time and reverse entropy flows in this film. Really, everything in the scene is about the manipulation of time, including the driver's lines about the duration of the torture session.
Running fast. We have to put it back 1 hour.
Literally, protagonists will spend this movie running fast, oftentimes an hour back in time. When the driver pulled out a molar looking for the cyanide pill given to the spies in case they were caught, he finds protagonists under his shoulder padding, but the decoy still has his, and the protagonist leaps to bite down on it. He wakes up to find Martin Donovan playing Faye, waiting for him to wake up from his coma.
Welcome to the afterlife. Suicide pills are fake. Why? A test.
Now, some have theorized that protagonist did actually die, and everything we're seeing is the afterlife of a spy. For Nolan, I think he's saying that in a world where time is a flat circle, we're all destined to end in destruction anyway, and we're all living on borrowed time, cycling back through patterns of behavior, trying to find meaning in it. Now, that's bleak, or it's beautiful, depending on whether you're okay not having free will, but I was always curious about this test because the pill protagonist bites was not originally his pill. It was in the hands of the decoy spy. That guy was wearing the suit of Jefferson Hall's spy character, and the pill would have been sewn into his cloth. So are all of the pills the CIA gives out fake? Tests designed to see which assets talk? Or was Jefferson Hall's character the original 007 test candidate, and John David Washington's character took his place through a random or a fated series of accidents? I mean, this movie only identifies the hero as protagonist, and it might be because he was never intended to be the chosen candidate, but he proved his worth anyway. Truly a man from nothing. Also, Sater later has one of these CIA poison pills, and we're left wondering if all the CIA pills are fake or just certain ones, and whether his plan to kill himself would have actually worked or not. I just like how these pills are a fun little mystery in themselves in the film. Now, Faye speaks cryptically, at first framing things in terms of temperature.
But until we feel that heat, we can never know. There's a cold war, cold as ice.
We see fire versus ice. Makes sense for members of the Tenet organization to see the world as alternating paths of thermodynamics, because that's where we derive the whole concept of entropy and reverse entropy. Faye says that to even know the war's true nature is to lose, and that his knowledge is divided. He's hinting at the truth that to possess the completed algorithm and to decode it means that their mission has failed. In a war against the future, they have to be at peace with none of them knowing the full picture, so that knowledge would never pass on and would forever stay buried. Their goal is to permanently stunt the Earth's growth and leave them in a kind of technological dark age for their own good. This is what Christopher Nolan wishes he could do with the Manhattan Project and with nuclear fission. If only we could unknow something. And Faye says,
all I have for you is a gesture in combination with a word, Tenet. It'll open the right doors, but some of the wrong ones too.
The right doors, but some of the wrong ones too, is likely a veiled nod to the turnstile doors and the fact that they always come in pairs. One for the forward moving, one for the inverted. We're not even sure if Faye knows that much. It seems like it's his job just to be a compartmentalized recruiter for the Tenet organization and to know the stakes of it, but not the mechanics of it. The protagonist is taken to a silo in the column of a wind turbine. The wind turbines, in addition to the rotation providing a visual motion that Christopher Nolan can reverse later in the film, and a reflection of humanity's adaptation to a global climate crisis that underpins the future society's beef with the present, seems at first like a pointless step for the protagonist, as he just waits in isolation for an unspecified amount of time. Why was he even here? Well, when you think back on it, you realize, whoa, the Tenet organization likely needed to keep him isolated because a future version of himself, or maybe even several layers of future versions of the protagonist, were actively looping back through time at this point in too many places, and they just needed to keep the still uninitiated stage of the protagonist isolated to prevent future exposure until he could be properly briefed. In this bunk, the protagonist finds a vial with 3 more silver suicide pills, and to be honest, now I'm wondering if these are the same pills that end up in the protagonist's mouth back in Kiev. And as the future founder of the Tenet organization, he will at some point have inverted back to that moment to place the suicide pills with specific agents. The protagonist gets taken by the organization to the shore, where, using a high-vis vest and a car with a program destination, he finds his way to an office park where he meets Barbara, Clémence Poésy, who observes that a high-vis vest and a clipboard can get you in anywhere, almost.
And I'm scared Tenet.
A ridiculous phrase, but it is a common in-joke on film production sets and studio lots that you can walk into any building with just a walkie in your hand and with confidence. So Christopher Nolan calling this an obscure Tenet might be his way of saying this is kind of a film industry in-joke. Barbara explains that she only knows the how, the what is his department. It's not clear if she knows that he's the future founder of the organization, and that's what she's alluding to by saying it's his department. But the way Clémence plays it, you get the sense that she might feel that she's being tested by the boss. She says,
we're trying to prevent World War III.
Nuclear holocaust.
Something worse.
Nolan uses the Pandora's box of Oppenheimer as a frame of reference for the science-based threat of this film. Barbara demonstrates inversion for the protagonist by having him point an empty gun at a chunk of wall filled with bullets, and his intention to shoot is what inverts the bullet back into the gun. She places 2 bullets on the table and explains that one is moving forward in time, the other is inverted. The protagonist is unable to distinguish.
How about now?
I love this little shot because Nolan obviously made Clemence drop the bullet on the table and then reverse that shot. So Clemence had to say the word now in reverse. So wown. And the awkwardness of that is why Nolan had to cut around it so abruptly. But despite the bullet being lifted off the table, it still makes a clatter sound as if it had just hit the table.
How about now?
Barbara invites the protagonist to try it himself.
You have to have dropped it.
And just that intent is enough for it to work for the protagonist, who now asks about cause and effect and free will.
Well, it wouldn't have moved if you hadn't put your hand there. Either way we run the tape, you made it happen.
This is how Christopher Nolan gets past the muddy logic of fate and destination in the movie. Within these localized instances of interacting with inverted objects, the future intent to do something is how you can summon or anticipate inverted bodies to your will. And Nolan didn't just make this up. Alan Watts' 1972 lecture on time was a groundbreaking touchstone in the way some academics have rethought human beings' linear perspective of time as an artificial construction. According to Watts, cause and effect are really just a man-made illusion. And in reality, the past, the present, the future could all be happening all at once. And this is just how we see them. And so Christopher Nolan posits that if you could just trick your mind into thinking deterministically, you can interact with inverted objects this way. So Tenet's weird time-twisting logic makes it possible to know what's coming and plan for it. But you know, that's not how life goes. We've all been sprinting for a bus only to have our foot slam into some gross puddle of curb water, and then your shoes are soaked and gross all day. No thanks! If you can't know the future, you can at least be prepared for it by wearing a pair of Vessies. Vessi makes waterproof sneakers that are stylish, comfortable, and lightweight. They're my go-to sneakers because there's no compromise. They go with every outfit, and they're durable enough to handle everything your day might throw at you, from dog parks to parking garages to coffee shops and food truck festivals. Lately, I've been wearing the weekend sneaker. Like all Vessies, they're fully slip-on, fully waterproof, and manufactured without any PFAS materials, and they're completely vegan. Step confidently into daily life with the waterproof ultralight Vessi weekend sneaker. With a 1-year warranty and worry-free 30-day returns, you're covered for every journey. Discover more at vessi.com/deep dive and get 15% off your first pair. Barbara explains that these objects are being inverted via reverse entropy, which she believes is a type of inverse radiation triggered by nuclear fission. So the idea of entropy in thermodynamics is that all systems in the universe are shifting toward disorder. Physicists debate whether entropy moving only in one direction is a reflection of time's actual linear nature, like time causes entropy, or the cause of us only being able to see time this way. Entropy creates time. Nolan in this movie assumes that entropy causes time, and if entropy can be inverted by radiation, the way that object moves through time can be inverted as well. Reverse entropy should not be possible according to thermodynamics, as it would mean a system that is somehow gaining energy, which could only be possible if it is moving backwards in time. In the background of this lab, but never addressed by the script, is a dry erase board with a diagram of the Maxwell's demon thought experiment that relates to this concept of thermodynamics, in which physicist James Clerk Maxwell, all the way back in 1867, tried to disprove the second law of thermodynamics, which states that heat always flows from the hotter regions of a system to the colder ones, aka entropy in action. Maxwell theorized of two chambers and a door between them, a door that could be controlled by a finite being, an entity later referred to as a demon by Lord Kelvin, that could quickly open or close the door to allow only fast-moving molecules, depicted in red, to pass through in one direction, and only slow-moving molecules, depicted in blue, to pass through the other, which would decrease the total entropy of the system without applying any work. Like the Sator square I talked about before, this is another example of the homework that Nolan clearly did to inspire the script for Tenet, but academic work that he just references in subtle ways without forcing the viewer into the lecture. Two chambers, one red side, one blue side, obviously inspired the turnstiles, a demon door, and between magically reversing the entropy. I think Maxwell was also partly the inspiration for Kat and Sator's son being named Max. Barbara says,
Don't try to understand it. Feel it.
This is reportedly what Nolan said when pitching the film to Warner Brothers, and anytime someone asked him about the logic of the movie. And it truly is the best advice when watching this movie. When you go into it trying to understand it, it breaks your brain. But when you let it take you away as just a sensory experience, it kind of works. What Nolan doesn't account for, of course, is that nearly all of the payoffs in this movie work best if you have some of that math running in your head. Otherwise, when things happen, you just kind of think, what the fuck did I just see? Barbara shows the protagonist rows and rows of drawers pictures of other inverted objects. The behind-the-scenes documentary reveals how the back end of this corridor shot was a backdrop that was just drawn by hand because they wanted to make it look like it would go on and on forever, like infinity mirrors, to indicate that they just found hundreds of thousands, maybe millions of pieces of inverted debris from this future war. So we move on to Mumbai, where the protagonist cases the home of Sanjay Singh, the source of the unusual bullet casing metal alloy. They shot this at the Neelam Shri Vardham Tower in the upscale Breach Candy area of South Mumbai. In the Bombay Yacht Club, we meet Neil Robert Pattinson. Ludwig Göransson scores Neil's arrival with this interesting buzz.
It seems you need an introduction to a prominent Mumbai local on short notice. I'm Neil.
Yeah, that buzz just makes us feel like this is a character that has his own interesting relationship with time that he's not letting on yet. Even the way Neil stares at the protagonist before saying, "I'm Neil," Robert Pattinson just fits in this look of familiarity, as if Neil is just like temporarily at a loss of words because he is looking in the face of the younger version of the old man who recruited him and trained him, gave him everything he knows, but he can't tell him that. Now, you'll notice Neil is also probably supposed to be slightly buzzed in this scene because he's ordering at least his second vodka tonic, so we just kind of shrug off any weirdness to him, like he's sweating more, right? He's supposed to be a little drunk, but he orders the protagonist a Diet Coke.
You never drink on the job. You're well informed.
Neil, of course, knows his drink order because they have worked together for years.
Well, I prefer soda water.
No, you don't.
And having experience with inversion is what inspires Neil on a way to get into the high-rise. If bungee jumping is the only way out of it, an elastic cable would be the best way up to it. Now, it's just kind of a normal cable slingshot up to the balcony, wound back up on a coil. There's nothing inverted about this hardware, but the idea to enter this way came to Neil because he's just used to thinking in reverse. Priya rings the alarm, but Neil is at the security station.
Don't let it get cold.
Now, this line is not in the script, but it is kind of a 007 style quip that might have been ad-libbed by Pattinson, another reference to cold versus heat in this entropic war. But it's not Sanjay they're after, but really his wife, Priya.
To say anything about a client would violate the tenets he lives by.
Priya is also a member of the Tenet organization, using this arms dealer arrangement as a cover to get closer to Russian billionaire Andrei Sater, one of the Sater square words. We learn the reason why the bullet casings were made today but inverted at some point in the future is that Priya sold these bullets to him recently, and through some connections with the future society, he was able to invert much of his hardware. Priya says,
To get anywhere near Sid, I would take a fresh-faced protagonist.
This is one of only 3 scenes in the movie in which the moniker of protagonist is actually spoken out loud, each of the times with Priya.
You are a protagonist. Did you think you were the only one capable of saving the world?
We've both been working for me. I'm the protagonist.
So it seems like it was really Priya who gave him the idea of using this as a code name, and this being the protagonist's first mission is very important. He wouldn't have been able to infiltrate Sater's ranks later in his career in the Tenet organization because at that point he would be all too well known. He had to do it when he was still just an initiate who didn't really fully understand how involved the organization was. Also, I guess you could say he had to do it as an initiate because he had already done it as an initiate, but you know, you get it, or you don't. Either way, we're okay. Police arrive.
You must have had a plan for getting out.
Not one I love.
I love how Neil just whizzes past us in a blur in the shot coming from the higher floor, but in a way, Neil has been looping past us in all kinds of ways through time this whole film. Someone really needs to make a cut of Tenet with all the background inverted Neils and all the background inverted old protagonists played by Denzel Washington. Like, you know you'd watch that, you psycho. On to London's Reform Club. The Reform Club was actually featured in 2 007 films, Die Another Day as the Blades Club, and everyone's favorite Bond movie, Quantum of Solace, as a government office. Jeremy Theobald plays the steward. He is a longtime collaborator with Christopher Nolan. He appeared in his student shorts, Larceny and Doodlebug, and then Nolan's earlier features, Following and Batman Begins. I love how saucy the protagonist is with him here.
Started without you. Hope you don't mind.
I'll catch up. Same for me, please.
I'll send the waiter.
I'll just pass on the order.
Actually, there's more wonderful 007 wordplay there. Like, I'll catch up, as in I'll catch up on the meal, but also I will catch up on the context of what the hell this mission is. And also, you're eating some fried chips there, so catch up. And not only is handling the steward this way a power move by a black man in a stuffy club, the protagonist also doesn't want to be interrupted by multiple unfamiliar faces during this sensitive conversation. Michael Caine plays Crosby, who informs the protagonist about Sater and his origin from one of the Soviet-era secret cities that were built around sensitive industries like nuclear towns around the USSR that were kept off the map. Sater's hometown, Stolsk 12, was never opened as a normal city later on, suggesting that it would have been some other place like Pripyat, the town beside Chernobyl, but the world just never heard about this one, which is very spooky. Crosby explains that on the day of the Kiev siege, there was a detonation in Stalsk 12, and from there, Sator emerged. He's literally talking about the Stalsk 12 battle that we will get to in the third act of this film, and the detonation will have to be completed and entered into the historical record for the future society to think the algorithm was buried there. Crosby explains that Sator's wife Catherine is an art dealer having an affair with a forger named Arepo, of course another one of the Tenet Sator square words, and Catherine sold one of Arepo's forgeries to Sator. The plan at this point is for the protagonist to use what he thinks is this scandalous affair to blackmail Catherine into setting up a meeting with Sator, but since it soon after falls apart when we learn that Sator was aware of the forgery and using that crime to blackmail Catherine into staying in a nightmare marriage with him, really this whole plot point just kind of amounts to a few things. One, Nolan finding an excuse to put Michael Caine in the movie, and Caine delivering half of this exposition through a mouthful of chips and still sounding dignified. And two, the protagonist proving to Crosby that he can play the part of a billionaire art collector by successfully eyeballing a Goya in a Harrods bag, so that the protagonist can get a royal credit card to up his wardrobe, which actually will prove essential because high-tailored wardrobe is essentially the billionaire's version of a vest and a clipboard. But because Nolan feels like he has to go through every step of the motions of a 007 movie exposition dump, he edits all of this at a breakneck pace so that it's really hard for viewers not to stop thinking about it and just feel it like he advises, because we feel like we're missing critical information. So to us, the end result is that it kind of sounds like this guy's sketch.
2 days before the detonation in Siberia, we intercepted a phone call between Petrov and a man called Darian Burkar to start a weapons company in Germany called Smertelsfolger.
Darian Burkar, the scientist? I thought he was dead.
He is dead. Or rather, he isn't. What does that mean?
So the protagonist observes how Catherine only gets a moment with her son every day on his way out of school, while a nanny hired by Sator looks like she's scared that she's gonna get yelled at, or something worse, by Sator later on. The Shipley's representative who greets the protagonist is played by Tom Nolan, Christopher Nolan's cousin and the son of John Nolan. Both John and Tom have appeared in several of Christopher Nolan's films. Elizabeth Debicki plays Sator's wife Catherine, who inspects the Goya forgery with a hint of familiarity at seeing her ex-lover's work.
What's it worth?
Let's not get ahead of ourselves. Lots of work to do before any kind of valuation. Provenance, microscopic examination, x-rays.
There's some fun double meaning here, because Kat in the next scene tells the protagonist that because the art authentication process takes so long with all these steps that she just mentioned, that's what allowed her to get close to Tommaso Repo. So by telling protagonist, let's not get ahead of ourselves, she's admitting, whoa there handsome, I'm not about to get another ex-lover's legs broken and tongue cut out. Or, you know, other things cut off and stuffed into places. At dinner, Kat confesses that Sator found out about the forgery and the affair and uses that to control her life, forcing a vacation to Vietnam 2 weeks prior.
I sat on that bloody boat watching the sunsets, imitating some earlier time in our lives.
Later, we will see that there was a second cat on this boat, imitating an earlier time, and it will be a literally bloody boat. That mystery woman that Kat saw diving off the yacht is herself. So when she later says that she longs to just dive off that boat and gain freedom, she's setting up her own future to literally be that woman. So yes, technically, according to this movie's logic, Sator died on that boat in Vietnam 2 weeks before all this. After the Sator we're about to meet inverts back through time to the day of that Stalsk 12 detonation. But as Neil will later say, that's not an excuse to do nothing, because Sator can only get to that destined death on the boat in Vietnam if protagonist and Kat and Neil all work together in the events that lie ahead. Sator's men, led by Volkov, remove Kat and confront the protagonist. Here we see why a fine tailored suit was so important, because it really tricked these goons into lowering their guard, assuming the protagonist was just some new money art lover, so that he can surprise them by being a brutal fighter, and a resourceful one at that. Like at one point, he uses this cheese grater to scrape the goon's hand, just to distract him with a bit of pain before some heavier hits. Kat sees Max the next day.
Anna says we're going to Pompeii and see lava.
This is the upcoming trip to the Amalfi Coast, and it's another glimpse at Nolan's homework into the archaeological origins of the Sator Square. Kat tells protagonists that she suspects Sator kept the other Goya in his vault at an Oslo Freeport, a section of the airport that Sator's construction company, Rotas, the fifth and final Sator Square magic word of this movie, builds for wealthy clients to store their valuables without having to pay import tax. Neil cases the vaults as the clerk explains that they based the structure on the vaults of the Pentagon, and we learn that each of these vaults is a separate structure within the others. which they realize is designed to house an innermost chamber that's the heart of one of Nolan's Inception mazes. It's a vault within a vault within a vault within a vault within a vault, 5 layers deep, and Inception was 5 dream layers deep. We also see here why Crosby told the protagonist that Brooks Brothers wouldn't cut it. He and Neil have to sport the finest tailor suits to be able to even initially case this Rotas vault structure to understand its layout, its gaps, and the door code that the guide has to punch in. Yet Neil nearly gives away his tell when the guide has to say, duh, these billionaires have their own private terminal. Part of what keeps this spycraft story so compartmentalized from the normal authorities and the outside forces and the media is that it's just really, really hard for normal people to successfully masquerade as being extremely wealthy, because rich snobs are always able to sniff out when there's an upper middle class poser among them.
I hear you've made an enormous faux pas. She's brought a ludicrously capacious bag. What's even in there? Huh? Flat shoes for the subway?
Another bit of interesting commentary here is how Rotas largely exists for billionaires to permanently store their art collections in a secure vault at an airport without having to pay import taxes, not to display them and enjoy them in their homes, just to own them so they can appreciate and value and collect dust, and really so that their rivals cannot get them. And it tells us how the Tenet organization will have to think in terms of that ungratifying zero-sum game in order to succeed. Like, the goal is to collect these very important artifacts, not to use them, but really just to bury them so they collect dust and no one else can ever use them. Neil also clocks in the private terminal how some crates are destined for Oslo, some for Tallinn, which tells him that Sator both has something of interest in this vault and in Tallinn. As we will later see, both are locations of turnstiles. Neil's suggested way in, since this is an airport that has its own government-backed security, is to just crash a big old plane into the private terminal.
You want to crash a plane?
But not from the air. Not so dramatic.
This is Nolan kind of poking fun at 2 of his past films, The Dark Knight Rises, which opens with Nolan dramatically crashing a plane from the air, which was a true practical stunt, and Inception, when Saito's proposal to bypass the first step of Fisher security is to just buy the whole freaking airline. Himesh Patel joins the cast as Mahir, Neil's operative, who will help them commandeer this Norsk freight jet along with his partner Rohan. Nolan and his team actually bought and used a real Boeing 747 for this crash sequence that they shot in Victorville, California. Somehow that was cheaper than using miniatures, and Nolan refused to use CGI for any of this. And yeah, while a giant practical jet crashing into a practical hangar is an impressive sequence to behold, especially the way it drags these parked cars along the way, I really see it as like the Trinity test sequence of this movie. It's a spectacle that's really big in Nolan's mind, but to the viewer, it's a bit underwhelming. But the reason Nolan did it this way is that he needed a practical and a pretty fun solution to their dilemma. They need this to look like just a dumb accident so that authorities and the media don't freak out over what would definitely look like a terrorist attack. Yet, it also needs to be big and sudden enough to trigger a fire so that Neil and the protagonist inside can exploit the lockdown of the vault layers. And Mahir and Rohan dump the gold bars that this Norsk freight was delivering to create the most chaos possible on the tarmac, because authorities would be so distracted keeping workers and each other from snatching any of that loose gold, like Rohan grabbed one. By the way, we later learn each of these gold plates is upwards of $300,000. So Rohan made off pretty good on this job. The protagonist and Neil get past the outermost layers. Neil senses that there's another layer of something already going on here, though.
There's someone in here with us.
That someone we will later see in the second half of this movie is his future self in an incapacitated cat who, on the other sides of the protagonist, looping back through here inverted, turnstiling and then reverting to normal, will also use this temporal pincer to get Cat reverted so that she can heal from an inverted wound. So Neil, in this moment, is sensing his future inverted self sneaking around these halls with him. They arrive at the innermost vault room with 2 doors. The protagonist enters on the left, the blue side. Neil enters on the right, the red side. And they find bullet holes in the glass in between, still smoking. And the protagonist realizes that they are seeing the aftermath of something that hasn't happened yet. And he knows this because he already saw the already formed bullet holes on the floor of the Kiev Opera House. And the turnstile cylinders on both sides open, and hello! On Neil's side, a forward-moving masked figure runs past him, and on the protagonist's side, an inverted masked figure springs backward out at him. Of course, we now know this is a future inverted the protagonist who had run in through the blue side of the room, went through the turnstile, reverted to normal, and continued running past Neil on the other side. But Nolan doesn't tell us what we're seeing yet. He wants us to be confused. He just chooses to show us all this while having no idea what we are seeing yet. We just think we're seeing 2 men coming out of a big ol' mystery box, and one of them doing impossible sorcery while fighting our hero, and we're just kind of like, huh? But in Nolan's mind, I'm sure he's like, I'm demonstrating how compartmentalization is how the Tenet organization is fighting this war. It's a war against the unknown. And I'm sure that's what we all thought the first time we saw this. But again, with the blue side being the inverted side, we're also staying consistent with the color coding, blue for inverted, red for normal progression. Now, when constructing the turnstile set, Nolan and his team conceived it as 2 rotating cylinders to indicate that you must be in motion to cross from one side to the other. And by constructing them this way, it would guarantee a sealed, air pressurized chamber during that transition, because to invert something, you must also invert the entropy of its oxygen molecules. When choreographing this fight and all action between normal and inverted things, Christopher Nolan established a rule where they could not use any reverse photography camera trickery to portray any characters or vehicles moving in reverse. It all had to be done practically, and he had to show his work. They had to do the hardest version of it. And since in this moment we are seeing several of the protagonists at different points of time co-occupying the same space, John David Washington had to shoot the scene again and again, ultimately from 4 different vantage points by the end of the film. So let's break those down in this moment. 1, the point of view of the normal protagonist the first time he enters this room and reacts defensively to the inverted combat of this mystery opponent. 2, the point of view of that mystery opponent in this first version of the scene doing these inverted combat moves. John David Washington had to do all that. And then 3, later in the film, when we loop back to this moment, John David Washington then had to perform all that same choreography in the normal progressive sequence. Now that we were within his inverted point of view with him. And 4, now that we had looped back to the vault, John David Washington also had to play his original suited self, but with all of those stunts in reverse. 1, 2, 3, 4. Now, the attention to detail is just so great here, and it comes so fast we don't even notice it. Like when the normal masked the protagonist comes back through the turnstile on Neil's side, he looks back at us through the glass at his 2 past selves, because he knows inverted bullets are about to fly from the wall on the other side back through the glass into the gun he would have just fired from his perspective. And here in this initial fight, before these 3 inverted shots return into the gun, there is a moment where normal the protagonist dislodges a gun from the inverted protagonist's hand, and the only reason he could do that is because the inverted protagonist hesitates a moment as he looks back to the right to make sure his future self, his self a few seconds into the future from him now on Neil's side, is out of the way of those shots. You see these glances look more punctuated and intentional later on in the movie on the other side of the fight, but they do exist in this version of it. I know, it's a lot to take in, and it's really just impossible to comprehend any of this on the first viewing, but rewatching these scenes multiple times, you can see how all the choreography was at least perfectly constructed for us to find on our 5th or 6th viewing of it. So the protagonist fights his inverted self in the outer hall and quickly realizes he's fighting someone who already knows his moves. There is an amazing inverted flip that John David Washington and his stuntman had to learn how to do practically by just shifting around on each other's weight. Meanwhile, Neil catches up to the forward running protagonist, and we realize later that the only reason he was able to catch up to him is because that future protagonist is exhausted after all of this, especially the tussle that he had just had to go through with his past self, the tussle that we are currently watching in this scene. Neil unmasks the guy and then decides to let him go. And later on, we'll see that's because he realizes it's a future version of the protagonist, and he knows in that moment that he just has to trust the process and make sure the protagonist trusts whatever this process is too. He has to express faith in the mechanics of the universe. And this all ends with this crazy moment of the inverted protagonist getting sucked out of the damaged rolling door. Later, we will see that he used the blast from the jet engine outside to blow himself in through this breach. And that's how we got into all of this. And when we cut to the jet engine outside, we actually see 2 firefighters standing to get away from it, and an ambulance pulls up. This, we will later see, is the future protagonist that Neil had just let go. Now, parking the ambulance for future Neil, an injured cat, to pick them up after they could revert through the turnstile. Now, in the scene, when the protagonist asks Neil what happened to that other guy, Neil just says that he took care of him, which is kind of his way of saying, future you will be up to something else on this night, and I just took care of you by letting you go. As they recover after this, Neil says,
Well, I've seen too much. I'm still alive, which must mean you've decided to trust me. Or maybe I lost my edge. Edge is still intact.
I think Neil might just be saying here, after seeing 2 yous last night, I'm clearly dealing with a Tenet operative who knows way more than I do, and thanks for keeping me alive or whatever I can do to help next, boss. And he quips that his edge is still intact because because Neil had just ensured that wherever the future of the protagonist was headed, he's still on that mission. The protagonist explains to Neil that they are dealing with a Cold War of a temporal nature, with objects and bodies with reversed entropy.
You mean reverse chronology? Like Feynman and Wheeler's notion of a positron as an electron, moving backwards in time.
We're seeing Nolan already flirting with the historical figures he will be using for his future Oppenheimer script. Feynman and Wheeler refer to Richard Feynman, played by Jack Quaid in Oppenheimer, and theoretical physicist John Wheeler's 1940 one-electron universe postulate, in which Wheeler theorized that the reason all electrons have the exact same charge and exact same mass is that they all could actually be one electron zigzagging back and forth through time. I know. Now, the protagonist responds to this by saying sarcastically, yeah, that's exactly what I meant. Because he doesn't have the education that Neil has, but as far as Neil knows, the protagonist could be speaking some truth here. Because both the protagonist and Neil will spend the rest of their lives as singular entities zigzagging back and forth through time, giving the illusion that there are multiples of them, but there are only ever one person. Actually, it was scripted lines like these in Tenet that likely inspired Robert Pattinson to gift Christopher Nolan with a book of J. Robert Oppenheimer's speeches after rapping on this film that led to Nolan reading American Prometheus and writing the Oppenheimer screenplay. The protagonist warns Neil to continue pretending this mission is all about plutonium or...
Well, when we're done, they'll kill you. Why do you have to do that anyway? I'd rather be my decision. So would I think.
This foreshadows Neil's decision at the end of the film. He knows he'll have to die to keep Tenet a secret, so why not do it on his own terms? Back to Mumbai, Priya shows a newspaper about the Oslo incident where the date shows the events of this movie as taking place in 2019. There's also an insurance ad for all generations, secure your family's future now. Now, Christopher Nolan isn't known for Easter eggs in his films, but he does love details. And this seems like a prop master detail added to reflect this movie being a time war between the future and the present. In this scene, the protagonist refers to the agents in the turnstile as antagonists, and Priya says that they were the same person. The twist, of course, being the protagonist and the antagonists are all the same person. Priya assigns the protagonist to help Sater steal what she says is the same package from Kiev, still calling it plutonium-241, even though she knows it's a piece of the inversion algorithm, because she still doesn't fully trust the protagonist to know what that artifact actually is. And maybe because she knows he's about to talk to Sater and wants him to still refer to it as 241 and not slip up, because if he slipped up, Sater would never trust him to work with him. Now, the edit cuts a scene short from the extra exposition that you can read in the screenplay for this film on page 53.
We have been attacked by the future. And Sater's helping. You have to find out how.
I suppose Christopher Nolan felt the script line of theirs is running out, so they're coming after ours might have just been a bit confusing, because it's not that the future scientists are trying to steal the time of the present, but rather they're just trying to solve whatever global crisis they are in the future by just reverting the flow of time for the entire world. I'll get to what the future scientists are actually trying to do later in this video, but I think the reason Christopher Nolan said Tenet works better if you don't think about it is partly because if you do try to think about what these future scientists are trying to do, there's really no way it makes that much sense. But again, as I'll explain later, it's not like a master plan in the future, it's a plan born out of desperation. Onto the Amalfi Coast. The protagonist asks Kat to introduce him to Sater as a State Department employee, implied to be having an affair with her, and she shows him Sater's mega yacht.
2 helicopters, missile defenses.
Afraid of pirates?
Andre lives playing one government off the other. Day they turn, that's his refuge.
You heard that right. A yacht with 2 helicopter pads and missile defenses. Sater is expecting warships and fighters to try to bomb him. Andre Sater is played by the great Sir Kenneth Branagh, and the way he first appears in frame is pretty creepy.
Max?
Who's the American?
Yeah, Nolan frames the shot just so that we get a glimpse of the empty terrace door outside, but there is just the slightest edge of Sater's arm in the frame to let us know that he was there, yet when he does appear in the doorway, it's as if he just kind of popped up from out of nowhere. Sater, as a threat in this world, is just someone who emerged into history pretty much from obscurity, like the future scientists selected him because he was a doomed nobody. The protagonist meets Sater, who promptly asks if he slept with his wife yet.
No. Not yet.
He's still saying yet, like, I'm gonna get there, sir. Sater threatens to cut his throat and stuff his balls in, but the protagonist asks,
do you like opera?
This stops Sater, because obviously he's referring to the artifact Sater was trying to acquire from the Kiev Opera House, but I also like how opera works as kind of a code word the same way Tenet does in this casual conversation, as both terms are again part of the Sater square. Sater asks if he sails.
You sail?
I've messed around on boats.
Be on the dock at 8, ready to do more than mess around.
Sator sets up a date sailing, and while Sator and Kat argue about Max's schooling, Sator has Kat served a Rubens sketch. This is based on Peter Paul Rubens' 1628 Studies of Women. This is the other Arepo forgery that Kat worried about that Sator ordered moved from the vault, presumably the moment his men spotted the protagonist visiting her at Shipley's in London. But Sator also says he's always had instincts about the future, so maybe after that Oslo incident, he used the turnstile to loop back to before the jet crashed into the terminal to extract that sketch from the Rotas vault so that he could still hold it over her. The protagonist and Sator discuss the opera siege and how in 2008 a remote Russian missile station was overwhelmed and 3/4 of a kilo of plutonium-241 went missing from a warhead until it supposedly resurfaced at the opera house. Now, why is this scene set on a high-speed sailing yacht? Well, remember Christopher Nolan is making his version of a 007 film, and those movies always have James Bond joining the villain on some excessive, extravagant pissing contest. But this also sets up Kat to try to murder Sator and the protagonist to save him, demonstrating trust between the two men. Sator tells the protagonist about his teenage youth digging up plutonium in the rubble of his home city, Stalsk 12, when the pot of a warhead exploded, scattering other warheads. Essentially, Sator was that type of worker depicted in HBO's Chernobyl series, working a thankless, life-shortening job digging up radioactive material in some other secret Soviet nuclear city after an accident the outside world was never told about. Young Sator is played by Adam Cropper, who is a shocking spitting image of a young Kenneth Branagh. Young Sator finds a buried capsule containing a document with his name on it. Animus Australis on Reddit translated this document to determine it is a template of a business license from the Russian Federal Taxation Service, with the word for license in Cyrillic replaced by the English letters of the name Andrei Sator. The future scientist who sent this to Sator registered a limited liability company named GSL Audit. So this license plus the bars of gold are how the future scientist set up Sator with a rich shell company to build his empire in the new Russia after the collapse of the Soviet Union. The protagonist demands that Sator not harm Kat, and as Sator goes to his bedroom, we see him taking off his belt. Sator in this movie always has a belt on, even when Kat eventually kills him. He's wearing a belt when his body sloshes off the deck. And we see in the next scene, it's part of his abuse routine. He even plugs his diamond cuff links into the holes, which just feels like part of his sadistic ritual that he does to torment the women in his life. The protagonist sees Sator receiving another future capsule with gold bars, inverted gold bars that fly back up into his hand, and Sator counts them one by one to realize that one of his attendants had pocketed one. The protagonist sees Sator beating that guy to death with the bar, and Volkov drags him in front of Sator, where he says that he's part of the CIA, saying that the CIA provides 2/3 of the market for fissile material anyway.
They're usually buying, not selling. But we do live in a twilight world.
Is that Whitman? Pretty.
Sator is proving that he knows the CIA passphrase that the protagonist exchanged with the asset in Kiev, but the phrase certainly means something different to Sator, who literally wants to reverse the sunset and the sunrise. Sator pays the protagonist up front with that same bloody gold bar, and the protagonist fumbles it, but on purpose, so that he can scoop up some of the soil that the capsule was buried in, which Neil later tests to show that it was from some radioactive spot in either Northern Europe or Asia. We learn that Sator does these dead drops with the future scientist, burying an empty time capsule in a specific place no one would dig up for centuries, and then transmits the location. Now, we're never shown how exactly Sator transmits that data to the future, but presumably it's some Dropbox, either a digital or a physical one, that is stored in a specific place as just a kind of way for future scientists to receive any of Sator's messages. In Tallinn, Estonia, Neil and the protagonist plan the heist for the cargo Sator once stolen from a reinforced truck, using heavy big rigs to box it in, and a fire truck with a ladder to crane over it, and a deceptively fast BMW getaway car. The protagonist says all of this has to be done verbally with nothing in writing, either digitally or on paper, already anticipating a future version of Sator might try to research the steps of whatever their plan was to ambush them. But the protagonist doesn't yet realize that Sator has multiple turnstiles, some large enough to fit an entire vehicle through, so he doesn't factor that into his plan. So we go into this Tallinn Freeway sequence assuming that we're just going to be watching a high-speed heist, similar to Nolan's work in The Dark Knight, when the Joker chased down a police prisoner convoy in his own truck. We don't really understand until halfway through the sequence that we're only seeing one half of a temporal pincer ambush by Sator and the future protagonist's attempt to stop him from doing that. Indeed, Nolan structured this whole movie just to be one half of the full story of Neil and the protagonist's friendship that we have to mentally extrapolate beyond the runtime of the film to understand. But this is Nolan's way of just kind of like setting the rules of the movie and just hoping that we can keep up and apply those rules to anything that might exist beyond the movie. However, he does try to help us out with a few clues, like as Sator threatens Kat again, he tells Volkov to tell him everything that happens in in the street heist as it happens so that he'll know the exact sequence of the cargo's movements when he is inverted. And that's why a little bit later, right after they get the cargo and unjam the radio frequencies, Neil intercepts their radio messages and he hears it as inverted Russian. That's them having that conversation. Also, Kat early on sees that the driver on the other side of the Freeport structure fence has a breathing mask on, meaning that this guy has already been inverted, standing by. And so we know from that at this moment that Sator is planning on inverting back through what we're about to see. And then of course, the amazing detail of the side view mirror on the BMW. The first time we see this mirror, before the BMW even approaches the truck, it's already damaged. And every successive time we see it, it stays damaged until the moment Sator's inverted SUV clips it, fixing it from our normal perspective. But the real detail that I love about this is before the first time we see that side view mirror, Nolan has strategically framed it behind John David Washington's head in all shots inside the BMW. Like, Nolan never wants us to see the status of the mirror in the earlier minutes of the mission, because logically this mirror would be broken from the moment the protagonist got in the car. But that's just a bit too confusing to think about, so Nolan just kind of covers it for the first minute of the sequence. So the protagonist recovers the cargo and realizes that it's not 241, but something weird, and we will learn this is a piece of the algorithm. But before they even understand what it is, they see Sator's SUV skidding ahead of them on the freeway, driving in reverse from their point of view. But in reality, and you actually see this later if you actually reverse the footage and do it slowly, from the inverted SUV's perspective, they sped past the BMW, clipped the mirror after the forced exchange that normal Neil and normal the protagonist are about to drive into. And again, Nolan and his team shot these inverted driving sequences practically, with high-speed reversing alongside high-speed forward driving, and many of these shots are actually background extra cars reversing at a consistent, slower, normal flow of traffic speed while the villain SUV steers aggressively through that flow, and then they reverse all of that footage to make it look like the one SUV is weaving violently but elegantly inverted through the normal traffic. This inverted SUV catches up to them, and it is Sator in a breathing mask, meaning he's inverted, holding a gun to Kat, counting down to 3, which means that Sator from his perspective is counting up to 3, knowing what this threat will look like reversed from the other side. But right after forward-moving protagonist sees this, an overturned silver Saab ahead of them on the road flips back on its wheels and seems to be inverted itself. Now, this silver Saab, we later learn, contains the inverted protagonist, trying to chase Sator down. But from the inverted Sator's perspective, he saw inverted protagonist's silver Saab spin out and flip, and then thought, okay, it's just me and the confused past one, and learned a valuable piece of information from seeing that we'll come back to later. The protagonist does the handoff with the orange suitcase, and a lot happens here. And it only becomes slightly clearer on the inverted side later, and since this whole sequence really hinges on what exactly happens in these few seconds, we really need to break it down both ways. Inverted Sator in the Audi is trying to get the orange suitcase with the algorithm piece inside of it from the forward-moving protagonist over in the black BMW with forward-moving Neil. The inverted protagonist, Silver Saab, was wrecked a moment ago, but has now reverse flipped, and he's now driving inverted in the Saab between the forward-moving protagonist in the forward-moving BMW and inverted Sator in the inverted Audi with its inverted driver. The normal protagonist tosses the orange suitcase, bouncing it off the hood of the Saab into Sator's hands, and inverted Sator takes that orange case through the Audi into another car, a Mercedes, that is moving forward with a forward-moving driver, and departs, leaving Kat to die in the speeding Audi so that the forward-moving protagonist has to save her and not go after Sator in this moment. So in this shuffle, we have the BMW, a Saab, an Audi, and a Mercedes. 4 different luxury car makers, which I think Christopher Nolan wrote into the script because he loves cars, and to help the crew reading the script and the assistant directors keep track of it all, because it's very complicated to communicate on set which car is doing what. Now, it also would have helped if he made them all different colors as well, instead of neutral colors, but you know, this is the world of spycraft, and they're not trying to be that showy. Keeping everything gray also helps train our eye on the orange suitcase. But right away, the first time we see the scene, if you're watching closely, you know something's up, because when the forward-moving protagonist tosses the orange suitcase, he keeps the algorithm piece in his hand. You see that the first time. It's a classic switcheroo, and I think he's counting on Sator being distracted by the flash of orange coming at him that he wouldn't see a chunk of silver metal behind it. So Inverted Satyr, after this, has an empty orange suitcase. How does he retrieve the algorithm piece later? Satyr's ultimate retrieval of the algorithm piece from this freeway is not shown on screen, but later, when the inverted protagonist is driving back down this freeway in the Saab, when we return to this handoff, inverted protagonist is surprised to see the algorithm piece already in the Saab, wedged between the seat and the door. It wiggles out and hops back into forward-moving protagonist's hand. So from that, we're meant to understand that the protagonist tossed the algorithm piece into the open window of this Saab, and that piece stayed there from the moment inverted protagonist got into it back at the Freeport, and that's where it would have stayed. But presumably, forward-moving protagonist's handoff switcheroo didn't fool Inverted Satyr, because from that moment later on, he sees where the forward-moving protagonist tossed the algorithm piece, and he knew that Saab would invert back to the Freeport lot where he would have had to invert. So later on, Inverted Satyr could revert to forward-moving and go back there and retrieve it from the car. Now, we will kind of see how this all looks from the inverted protagonist's perspective later, but the Freeport turnstile chamber scene after this concerns where exactly the protagonist hid the algorithm piece. So to understand what's going on in that conversation, I think it helps to know this going in. Kat knows that the protagonist will have to get into her car, so she has to reach her leg into the driver's seat to hit the child lock. Honestly, I think Christopher Nolan casting Elizabeth Debicki, in addition to Debicki's talent, is also because Debicki is 6'2" with long legs, and her pulling this off is somewhat plausible. After some tense moments, the protagonist gets into the Audi and stops it, but immediately they're ambushed by the forward-moving half of Satyr's team.
Sit, I'm calling the cavalry. What cavalry?
Neil is referring to Ives' team, the military unit that's part of the Tenet organization that Neil has already been working with. This devolving into a shootout with Ives' cavalry soon interfering is partly why Satyr is in such a rush with the protagonist and Kat in the chamber later. Ahead of him, from his vantage point, will be an even messier shootout where he will have only a few seconds to search one car before all these vehicles go back from this roadblock to where they started from. Some of Satyr's guys grab the protagonist and take him to the Talon Freeport. A few others grab Kat from the backseat. Through this fence, the protagonist sees Kat being pulled by Inverted Satyr. This is the Satyr with the respirator mask that we saw on the freeway before, but Kat is not inverted. We don't really see it, but the guys who grabbed Kat from the backseat handed her off to Inverted Satyr as they rendezvoused at this Talon Freeport lot, as Inverted Satyr was at his exit point from the blue side of the turnstile. It's kind of hard to see, but since Debicki and Brenna had to move like this practically, they both walk in these awkward movements so that Brenna kind of looks like he's doing the reverse of what a normal forward lunge would look like, if that makes sense. While Debicki and her heels kind of tangos forward, but since she's being pulled by Inverted Satyr's force, she also has to kind of look like she's being the reverse of pushed instead of pulled. Again, no one would notice this from behind the fence other than, that kind of looks weird. But Christopher Nolan is like, no, I think it really needs to be accurate. We see a similar awkward tango inside from the protagonist's point of view on the red side of the turnstile as Inverted Satyr reverses and Kat moves forward as if she's the opposite of being pushed. Satyr straps the respirator mask on her because now the air on the blue side of the room is inverted and Kat right now is not. Compared to the Oslo airport turnstile, this one in Talon is larger, big enough for large groups of people and vehicles to go through. We actually see one car covered in the background on the red side. This explains how Inverted Satyr's car a few minutes ago could itself get inverted. Because the protagonist at this point has been in a room like this before, where bullet holes were already in the glass separating the sides, he now sees a bloody bullet embedded in the glass and does some mental math to know it must come from somewhere and it must be someone's blood. Inverted Satyr interrogates the protagonist on where he left the algorithm piece, but the protagonist hears his questions reverted audio first, before we see Inverted Satyr's lips move to ask it.
You left it in the car, not the fire truck, right?
Told you that! Inverted Satyr, from his point of view, is about to head back out into an inverted world, and based on the radio messages he's been getting from the inverted half of his team in the temporal pincer, there are really two options of places to look, he thinks. The BMW glove box that the protagonist and Neil were in, or the fire truck that they used to steal the case. Inverted Satyr doesn't yet know that there really is a third option, the Saab. In the making of documentary, you can see how Kenneth Branagh actually wrote out each of his lines in the scene in a Russian accent, but with each of the phonetic syllables in reverse for him to pronounce it. This is true dedication. Like, he wanted his lip movements to be accurately, visibly in reverse of what Satyr would be saying through the speaker. Inverted Satyr fires an inverted bullet through Kat's side, and the protagonist tells him that he left it in the glove box of the BMW. Now at this point, forward-moving Satyr comes in on the red side and asks,
Where did you leave it?
Car or fast track, which one?
From Red Side Sator's perspective, this is the beginning of the interrogation, an interrogation that will continue on the other side, the blue side of the turnstile. Sator is forced to hurry into those turnstile doors before killing the protagonist because Ives' cavalry arrives and chases him. But at this point, we already know Sator has successfully inverted into the past unencumbered. Now we see the interrogation from his inverted point of view on the blue side. I love the detail that since Kat in this inverted room is not inverted, when her reversed self exhales through the mask, her hair kind of moves according to the inverted movement, kind of like exhaled CO2 going back into her lungs and dragging her hair toward her face. Inverted Sator shoots the bullet through Kat, causing her to no longer be wounded. Sator now takes this hostage Kat with him outside because he knows it's part of his temporal pincer plan to use her on the freeway. Aaron Taylor Johnson joins the film now as Ives, giving us some much needed exposition for what the is going on by defining a temporal pincer movement.
Pincer movement. But not in space, in time. Half his team moves forward through the event, he monitors them and then attacks at the end moving backwards, knowing everything.
Since we're now dealing with the military arm of the Tenet organization, all of their explanations of the temporal technology have moved away from the lofty academic and philosophical concepts to practical soldier jargon, because these are troops who have moved back and forth through turnstiles for who knows how long, and their priority is how to safely move through an inverted world when it comes to gravity, inertia, friction, airflow, heat, etc. The protagonist tells Neil and Ives that he lied to Sator about where he stashed the algorithm piece, and he decides to take injured Kat back through the turnstile to stabilize the radiation from the inverted bullet. Ives reminds us that they can't spend the weeks it'll take to invertedly heal here because they only took control of this facility minutes ago. So they gotta get out of there.
We found another machine. A week ago? Where? Oslo.
Now, looking back at this movie, you might ask, wait, doesn't Ives and his army have that big old boat with the revolving door to invert or revert people whenever they want? Yes, they do. And a moment after this, Ives reveals he does know all about the Oslo turnstile. This is not a plot hole because Tenet is a super compartmentalized organization, and Ives doesn't yet know if he can trust this American with their most sensitive piece of machinery or tell him where other turnstiles might be. Just a second ago, these parties were afraid to say out loud to each other that the artifact they're chasing isn't just plutonium-241. Ives calls the glass separating the halves of the room a proving window, as it's the window you look through to prove your inverted self is approaching the turnstile door on the other side to let you know it's your destiny to go through on your side. I also like the double meaning on the word proving because it also recalls a proving drawer in baking, a drawer that can be heated to a temperature warmer than the room temperature but cooler than an oven would be, used to help activate yeast and let dough rise. So in a sense, you're also looking into this proving window to see a transfer of thermal energy and allow the gluten threads of your fate to come together. I also love the little deterministic logic fart Ives brings up here.
If you don't see yourself in the proving window, do not enter the machine. Why not? If you don't see yourself reverse exit the machine, then you ain't getting out.
Ha! So basically, if you try to will your fate by entering the machine without seeing your inverted self will meet you at that midpoint, then you'll just be stuck in the machine for eternity and become kind of an infinite Schrodinger's cat, flipping in and out of a quantum reality. For Ives, seeing their inverted forms approaching on the blue side tells him, well, I guess I'm fated to take this cowboy on the other side, and they transfer. Now, on the other side, the protagonist reveals he's gonna go back out into the world for the artifact and for Kat. He asks Neil what would happen if Sator makes good on his promise to kill Kat in the past, and Neil says it's impossible to know that.
It's unknowable. But what do you believe? What's happened's happened.
This phrase, what's happened, happened, is a recurring way of explaining time travel logic in certain types of time travel stories. In my 8 types of time travel stories thesis, I call this type 4. This always happened, which means that future acts of time travel have already had their impact on the life the characters have lived. What's happened, happened is a way for characters to say, it's too late to change the past. This is not Back to the Future. This isn't about changing history. It's about revisiting history to see what your time traveling self's role always was in that history. Another version of this phrase actually came from Dr. Daniel Faraday to explain time travel logic in Lost, season 5, episode 11, and whatever happened was actually the title of that episode.
It's like a street, right? We can move forward on that street, we can move in reverse, but we cannot ever create a new street. If we try to do anything different, we will fail every time. Whatever happened, happened.
Ives calls the protagonist's upcoming impulsive act cowboy shit, because the protagonist is headed out to save a woman they don't think they need. Of course, they will need her. She is the one who, in the end, kills Sator without setting off the dead man's switch. We could look at this cowboy shit as the origin moment for the man who will one day lead the Tenet organization, because he was right about saving Kat and how important she would be to stop Sator, and in a sense, paved his path in the organization. Like, this cowboy didn't hesitate to go inverted with minimal training, and that must have ultimately impressed this whole army into thinking, we need dudes like this. Now, the female soldier who briefs him is named Wheeler. The name Wheeler might be another reference to the Manhattan Project. John Archibald Wheeler was the Princeton professor who was part of the Chicago Metallurgical Lab and designed nuclear reactors. Wheeler drops a bunch of inverted physics tips that all come so fast it's kind of hard to take them in.
When you run, the wind will be at your back. You encounter fire, ice will form on your clothes.
I guess the idea being, when we run normally, air hits our face to feel like wind. So in the rest of the non-inverted world, it would look like that person is running in reverse, so the wind would be at their back. To help picture this, let's look at the protagonist's initial movement in the lot outside, but let's reverse the footage ourselves. To the rest of the world, this is how inverted protagonists would look, inverting backward toward the door, so the wind would therefore be at his back. Fire turning into ice is how the protagonist survives the car explosion later. The protagonist plans to use the transponder on the orange case to track where the inverted Sator would have tossed it, making it the ball for him to follow into the handoff on the freeway. The protagonist ventures out into the world as an inverted individual, and this opening moment does a really cool job using atmospheric details to establish simple visual and auditory cues of things being reversed from his point of view, like the seagulls' flight and their squawks, and that passing boat in its horn. But more important for what's to come, little details showing the physical effects of things that the inverted protagonist is about to do before he does them. For example, the puddle water drips up to his boot before he steps into it, because reversed, he would have stepped into it and lifted his boot and water would have dripped off of it. And when he starts the car, the gravel flies back under the tire, because reversed, the tire would have skidded backwards to a stop. And just a reminder, the Saab, parked here at the dock this whole time, is the last known resting place of the algorithm piece wedged into the side of the seat, unbeknownst to the protagonist in this moment, but ultimately waiting for Sator to revert back again and come pick it up. The protagonist initially struggles to figure out the friction of driving inverted as pedestrians go from bewildered stares to turning back forward oblivious. Meanwhile, inverted Sator, the Sator who just left the blue side of the room, moves through the shootout at the roadblock and looks into the BMW glove box as the protagonist told him, finding nothing. So he returns to his Mercedes, realizing it must have been somewhere else. So now we go back to the protagonist in his Saab, waiting, as Wheeler told him to look to suddenly unstable objects. Sure enough, that orange case starts wiggling, meaning it's about to fly back into something, and it is Sator's Mercedes. Now, a reminder that this Mercedes, the vehicle, is not inverted. It is forward moving. It's being driven by the forward moving half of Sator's gang, someone without a mask. So it must have been some forward moving henchmen driving it who tossed the case out when they realized it contained nothing. But in that Mercedes, that forward moving driver had the orange suitcase taken back from him from inverted Sator, because inverted Sator knows the exchange of the case must have been where the algorithm piece got hidden somewhere. So the protagonist drives after them, and we get more fun physics on the freeway. Some trash is caught behind the wheels of the Saab, then the trash flies out in front. Nolan adds so many visual details to try to keep us in this inverted headspace, but again, it's all so much, and it's so hard for us to take it all in. I think this movie was designed to be appreciated and understood like on the 6th or 7th watch. Now, while the protagonist's crazy drive is happening, that is when inverted Sator transfers from the Mercedes to the Audi to do the reverse of leaving Kat behind to die. But we don't see that in this moment. We stay with the protagonist, who speeds up and catches up to inverted Sator in the inverted Audi to the moment before that, the handoff. Sator's eyes go wide as he sees a doppelganger of the protagonist, who he realizes must also be an inverted form of him, suddenly appearing there, and he sees the algorithm piece wiggling out from where it was back to the forward-moving protagonist's hand in the BMW. Sator then reverse catches the orange suitcase, sending it back to the normal protagonist, and he forces his driver to veer into the Saab, flipping it. And so in this moment, the inverted protagonist realized, shit, the overturned car that flipped back on its wheels that I saw before was my own inverted future self. And by driving back into this handoff, I showed Sator where the algorithm piece was hidden. It was his destiny either way. What happened happened, but it must feel like a defeat nonetheless to the protagonist. Sator taunts the protagonist that he saw this handoff.
I need to get my pulse above 130. No one's done that before. Not even my wife.
He's phrasing it like sex never got him that excited, but really he's referring to his heart rate while abusing her with his belt. Sator tosses a lighter in the gas to blow up the protagonist's car, but because thermodynamics are inverted, extreme ice forms instead. Now, did Sator know that he would not be burning the protagonist to death? I assume yes, because someone from Siberia would know that extreme cold can be just as deadly. The protagonist was lucky that Ives and the rest of the group found him and space blanketed him up before he died of hypothermia. The protagonist wakes up in this enclosed inverted shipping container with Neil and Kat on a Rotas ship headed back to Oslo. The protagonist asks Neil how deep he is in the Tenet organization.
Who recruited you, Neil? It can't possibly do you any good to know that right now.
I love how Robert Pattinson says this. It's not defensive, but with just a bit of exasperated patience, because he's talking to a younger version of his future boss and mentor, and he needs the boss to stay focused on the mission. After some time on this boat, the protagonist feels a pain starting to form in his arm. This is from the scuffle he's about to have with his forward-moving past self in Oslo. Neil explains that the algorithm is a 9-part physical representation of a mathematical equation in the future that future scientists want so that they can invert the entire world's flow of time. Normally, because the world's environment always flows forward in time, inverted random objects' effects are just kind of temporary and ultimately corrected. But if the whole world's entropy is inversed, Neil says, the result would be that the present and past are destroyed instantly. So, how would that work? This movie doesn't really say. One interpretation is that, environmentally, the effects of climate change from human impact are reversed over time. But logically, that might not even work, because if the whole world inverted, that polluted future world would stay polluted theoretically. Like, if you're a human being with a tumor and you go through a turnstile gate, it's not like your whole body reversed is gonna have that tumor shrink and shrink and shrink over time. You're still gonna have that tumor. The tumor is also reversed and will continue to grow. So another interpretation that I really love is that the orbital path of Earth around the sun would suddenly move in the opposite direction, leaving the forward-moving Earth still on its original path, and in 6 months, the two doppelganger Earths will collide into each other on that orbital path. Or we could take this to mean that after the future scientists get their hands on the completed algorithm, they invert their whole world, and that just kind of magically erases everything in the past to give those future scientists a blank slate to claim as their own destiny. Now, in the script, Sator tells Kat while looking at the sunset in Vietnam, "Tomorrow the sun will rise in that same spot for the first time in history because I told it to." The line is not in the film, but it indicates that Sator at least believes the algorithm will invert Earth's rotation and perhaps also its orbit around the sun. We don't know if he means the entire cosmos itself will invert back to the Big Bang or anything. I think Neil means this as more of a thermodynamic issue, like inverting a whole planet on that scale will screw with the laws of physics and gravity and thermodynamics so much that it just instantly devastates everything within that range in all periods of time in the history of that planet. At least that's the Tenet organization's belief based on the future Oppenheimer of her time who invented the technology and hid pieces of the algorithm into the past. Neil and the protagonist debate the grandfather paradox.
But in the future, those in power clearly believe you can kick Grandpa downstairs, gouge his eyes out, slit his throat without consequence.
So the protagonist asks if this is what would actually happen.
Doesn't matter. They believe it.
And Neil also says that just because they are here right now doesn't mean that they've won this war.
In a parallel worlds theory, we can't know the relationship between consciousness and multiple realities.
So here, Neil is saying they don't know which of the 8 time travel types they're living in. If it's a multiverse, the 2 of their lives could still end up in fiery destruction. So we have to ask, why do these future scientists think this is a good idea? Are the future scientists crazy? Is this whole movie illogical and stupid? No, I don't think so, but Christopher Nolan seems to believe that humanity often is illogical and stupid, and will be increasingly illogical and stupid in the future. Later on in this film, Sator will hint at the climate crisis that the future will find itself in.
How could they want to kill us?
Because their oceans rose and their rivers ran dry. Don't you see? They have no choice but to turn back. They're responsible.
No choice implies a future society driven to the point of desperation, blinded by irrational anger at the past. So again, we are to assume that Tenet is an analogy for the invention of the atomic bomb. The atomic bomb was invented in an era when our brightest minds were terrified of an existential threat. They believed that that was the only option. So imagine a future so driven to the extremes by climate crises and famine, plagues, epidemics, mass starvation, water wars. Imagine the planet's population has reduced reduced significantly and humans are close to going extinct, the few scientists left in that dystopia, burnt out after trying anything else, would finally cave and convince themselves that they had to try something crazy and extreme, illogical, insanely risky, a last resort to save the human species. That's how they would have settled on this crazy plan of worldwide inversion. And the fact that the future scientists' plan is so illogical is, I believe, this movie's commentary on how crazy and desperate human society can become when we grow over-reliant on technology to solve our problems and stop relying on basic human decency. Recognizing that the audience is likely feeling confused at this point, this scene asks,
Does your head hurt yet?
Yes.
Try sleep.
Many point to this look that Neil gives Kat as a possible clue that Neil is a grown-up version of Max, Kat's son, but there's a lot of things you can look at this movie to justify that theory. So their shipping container arrives at the Oslo airport, where they now plan to use the chaos from the crash and the breach to slip back into the Rotas vault. Nolan uses the audio cues of the sirens first, meaning the last of the ambulances would have just left the airport, and then we hear the start of the jet engines, meaning that 747 crash would be more recent and the plane was still hot. The protagonist's arm pain gets worse and he finds a cut in his sleeve, and then he starts to bleed, as if the reverse of clotting. This is kind of a human injury form of the broken side view mirror in the Freeway sequence, a bit of physical damage that gets worse and worse as we get closer and closer to the moment it happens. In the case of this injury, the injury itself is still forward moving because it was caused by the protagonist's forward moving counterpart. So they head out into the chaos of the fire crew fighting the flames, correctly guessing that in this scramble, the firemen would be more focused on the fire than a couple of weirdos running backward with a gurney. For all the firefighters know, it's emergency personnel backing away in fear of the flames, too afraid to take the time to turn around and run properly. And we don't realize this until a few moments from now, but the yellow ambulance parked to the left in this moment is actually the protagonist's future forward-moving self on the other side of the turnstile they're about to go through, waiting for Neil and Kat on the other side of that turnstile. But as they approach the fire hoses, the spray shuts off right before they cross into its path, which means that from the firefighters' point of view, they waited for these randos to clear out of the way. They started hosing in this area. The 747 crash was Nolan's one of two total Cecil B. DeMille shots of this movie, and I love how he found a way to get double his money's worth out of it by palindroming back to it now. The reversed water spraying seems like an impossible shot to me, since the protagonist and Neil are definitely running forward in the same frame. I feel like Christopher Nolan must have cheated a little and used VFX for the inverted water. Like, he didn't composite the protagonist and Neil into a reverse shot. Those firefighter extras are all clearly stuntmen committing to a physically reverse movement here. We see the post-explosion jet engine whirring back up, meaning this would be right after it exploded, and they brace for impact because that explosion itself was forward moving and the blast would still move outward and blow the protagonist back through the newly formed breach. And now, as we return to this moment, Christopher Nolan keeps us in the sounds from within the inverted protagonist's helmet, just his breathing and the muffled sounds of the forward-moving protagonist and forward-moving Neil arguing. And now we know how forward-moving protagonist ended up pinning his inverted counterpart earlier. The inverted protagonist initially didn't know what the hell was going on in the scuffle, as his forward-moving self was further along in the fight and had gotten wiser to what exactly he was fighting. So here, from our point of view, the inverted protagonist is taking more hits and he scrambles more. But then Nolan shows us the exact moment the confidence flip happens. Right there, on that arm grab, is the moment the inverted protagonist realizes what he is doing. And from here forward, we see the inverted protagonist get more and more in control of the fight, and the forward-moving protagonist get less and less confident. Part of that confidence flip is also the inverted protagonist remembering, perhaps through muscle memory, how he had tried to overpower himself in the past. So now, inverted protagonist successfully blocks each of the forward-moving protagonist's blows, and we see those power blocks from his point of view. And we also see how each of his blows are non-lethal, because the inverted protagonist is taking great pains to not injure his past self. Then we get back to the turnstile chamber to the moment the forward-moving protagonist stabs his arm, and then the 4 gunshots into the proving window. So why does the inverted protagonist even fire these shots? Well, each time you'll notice he doesn't shoot until his forward-moving counterpart has already moved his head out of the way. So really, I think he does it to empty the clip before his forward-moving counterpart gets a hold of that gun. I mean, if this weren't such a chaotic, physically violent scramble, he would have remembered that no one ended up getting shot here. Like that was just the fate of this moment. But you know, when you're in the middle of it, you don't think that way. Then the inverted protagonist looks back through the proving window at the door, waiting for his other self, and that's the hesitation that we pointed out before that the forward-moving protagonist takes advantage of. Forward-moving protagonist gets the gun, and inverted protagonist dismantles that gun. And now, finally seeing his other self in the proving window, he leaps into the turnstile, justifying why earlier in the movie his past self came out of the turnstile with his back facing out. Now, another little mystery this movie doesn't explicitly answer: how does a turnstile turn on whenever it's used? Is there some kind of lever or button inside that both sides activate and hold down when they're both in place to close the door and initiate the rotation? I looked at all the shots in this movie inside of the turning chamber. No one touches anything along the walls of it. So I kind of like the idea that the door itself is kind of automated to open and close on its own, maybe through weight sensors or motion sensors, or maybe just a kind of destiny or fate, as this is based on Maxwell and Kelvin's demon door. Maybe an evil little magic that opens and shuts a door when destiny feels so inspired. So we follow the protagonist into the past in a now forward-moving world. We better understand the protagonist's exhaustion as Neil catches up to him and removes his mask, and now, after realizing who it is, rushes back to get to the other protagonist. Why does he run? Perhaps he thinks it's his destiny to go break up the other two and keep one from killing the other. As the newly freed protagonist rounds a corner, you can start to see his two wrestling other selves in the background spilling over past the distant corner. And one other question that I think we all just take for granted while watching this sequence and its earlier version: why do they fight? Why does the protagonist immediately go into physical combat mode the moment he runs into just a mystery masked man? Why not give him the benefit of the doubt? Why not react just like, whoa, mystery dude who popped out of this mystery Seder treasure vault, you just bumped into me, but I don't know who or what the hell you are, so maybe just be on your way and ask for an apology? Like, I know why all future versions of protagonists have to defensively block and parry the blows, but why is it initially necessary? Why is it the protagonist's destiny to fight his future self? Well, I see this as the protagonist's arc in this movie, to go from doubt to faith, from distrusting everything and seeing every player as a hostile double agent, to later on in his life, believing that everything will work out if he just follows his instincts to trust players and confidently forge the relationships that he knows he will be able to continue building in the future. So therefore, Act 1 protagonist instinctively fights every mystery player of this game, but Act 3 the protagonist learns to believe and trust every mystery and have faith. The protagonist runs through the garage door, passing inverted Neil, who's now minutes before the jet engine explodes. Nolan edits the moment they pass each other by switching from forward-moving protagonist's point of view to inverted Neil's point of view, and we hear the word go twice. Once forward-moving, go, to another time inverted, og. Go. What? Because inverted Neil sees forward-moving protagonist as, to him, reversed. Inverted Neil carts inverted cat inside, the halide gas sprays, so he knows this is the moment his past forward-moving self and forward-moving protagonist are about to come out of the sealed art vault, which Neil now sees reversed from his point of view. Inverted Neil carts cat into the turnstile room, which we initially see from inverted Neil's point of view at his forward-moving self in the proving window, now joining him in the turnstile. They invert and now find themselves forward-moving in the past after the 747 crash, but before its damaged engine explodes. As their ambulance pulls away, you can see inverted protagonist and inverted Neil with cat on the cart from the moment they emerged from the shipping container at the start of this little temporal pincer at the Oslo turnstile. All the details are just so neatly tied up in this movie. Neil explains to the protagonist that he didn't tell him that he saw his face under the mask all the way back then because he's falling back on faith. What's happened happened. So now they're about 9 days before Talon, but 2 days before the protagonist's second meeting with Priya in Mumbai. The protagonist wants to meet Priya before that to tell her not to tell his other self that the artifact is P-241, but rather tell him the truth, that it's actually something way worse, so that he wouldn't risk dangling it out in front of Seder and Talon a week after that. that. So he catches up with Priya in Oslo at what's called in the script an Oslo War Memorial, but they actually shot this at the real-life Mariamäe World War II Memorial in Tallinn, Estonia. I'm sorry if I pronounced that wrong. In either case, this being a memorial for World War II, a war that ended with atomic bombs, serves as a fitting backdrop for what Priya now explains. The protagonist says the magic word of algorithm, and now Priya knows for sure that he's further along in his timeline and knows enough of the big picture for a full briefing. She recalls the Manhattan Project and J. Robert Oppenheimer's concern that before the first Trinity test, they might produce a chain reaction that would destroy the world. Of course, Christopher Nolan would explore that anxiety over that possibility, quantum microscopic detail in the Oppenheimer film a few years after this. The protagonist says that we got lucky in the 20th century, but in this reality, that chain reaction did continue by providing the future scientists with radioactive hotspots in which to operate and locate an ally in the past to help them reassemble the algorithm. So in a way, it did end up destroying the world. Priya explains that the woman who invented the algorithm that could invert the world, unlike Oppenheimer, listened to her conscience and hid the algorithm in 9 separate pieces in nuclear containment facilities built atop underground hypocenters where bombs were tested underground, making them now hotspots that would stay radioactive for a millennia. Priya reminds us that there are 9 nuclear powers. Now, for reference to you, those 9 countries are the United States, which gained this power in 1945, the USSR, now Russia, which gained this power in 1949, the United Kingdom, which gained this power in 1952, France, which gained it in 1960, China, which gained it in 1964, Israel, which has never confirmed whether they have the bombs for sure, but is widely believed to, gaining the power sometime in the late 60s, India, which gained this power in 1974, Pakistan, which gained this power in 1998, and North Korea, which gained this power in 2006. And that would mean that Sator might have dug up all 9 pieces from radioactive burial sites in any of these 9 countries. Neil said that the soil that they found on the gold could have been from Europe or Asia, but it is unlikely that any of these sites would have been the Trinity site in Los Alamos in New Mexico, because that's arguably the most famous testing site. Most of the burial sites probably would have been in Russia, because the Soviet Union was the most secretive and prolific with their testing, and these are areas that Sator probably would have less trouble getting to, as opposed to like a burial site in North Korea. Once Sator has gotten the last piece in Tallinn, Priya says he would have all 9, which Priya says she wanted to happen.
That is the only way he'll bring together the other 8.
I was supposed to steal it, then lose it.
Mission accomplished.
But the protagonist still has some leverage to try to fix this his own way. He's the only one in the Tenet organization who knows when and where the algorithm reassembly will take place and be dropped for the future society to find. He's the only one who knows that it will be in Stals 12. He uses this to force Priya to let him use Kat in the next step of the Tenet mission to recover the algorithm without Sator knowing. Priya promises Kat and her son will be safe, a promise that she will break and it will cost her dearly. But Priya confirms that the Tenet organization was not formed sometime years in the past, but will be formed sometime in the future, which tells us that most of the organization is made up of people comfortable spending long amounts of time inverting, and of course an organization that must have its own turnstiles. I think that's an important tenet for us to consider, especially if you're skeptical that Neil might have been able to be Max, because yes, that would have required him to spend decades of his life on the inverted side of reality. This is an organization that has its home base being inverted. So now we move on to the Magna Viking, a tug ship that we see moving in reverse from Trondheim in Norway to somewhere in Siberia through this wind farm in the Barents Sea, which is between the Arctic Circle and Finland and Russia. But they actually shot this at an offshore wind farm near Denmark. The protagonist is doing pull-ups outside wearing a respirator mask, allowing his air to be inverted, showing how he is training his muscles to learn how to operate when things like gravity and wind resistance are being inverted. Presumably, this is also the wind farm where his past self spent a lot of time sequestered in isolation at the beginning of this film, as I assume this waterway is well patrolled by the Tenet organization. And it's just fitting that the protagonist does pull-ups outside here, just like he did pull-ups inside of the wind turbines before. Neil and the protagonist tell Kat that Sator's fitness device works as a dead man's switch, so that when he dies, it will trigger an email burst that will create a digital record for posterity and notify the future scientists the exact location of the dead drop containing the buried, completed algorithm. It's why the Tenet organization hasn't risked assassinating Sator until they know that they are in possession of the algorithm. Kat tells him that they have even less time than they thought, because Sator plans to take his own life because he has inoperable pancreatic cancer, likely an effect of digging in so many radioactive sites. And the three of them deduce that he plans to end the world on the 14th, 10 days before they are now, during his and Kat's holiday in Vietnam, where she tried to make nice with him one last time. Neil confirms,
It was in Ukraine, at the Kiev Upper Siege. How do you know about that?
Now, Neil doesn't answer this question, of course, because he was there in Kiev, saving the protagonist with the inverted bullet. But knowing that Sator was in Ukraine is how they confirm that it must have been a future version of Sator who flies back to the yacht, and that must be the day it's all gonna go down. On the Magna Viking, we see soldiers training for battle, including inverted soldiers like Neil summoning a non-inverted gun up to his hands. I'm pretty sure Robert Pattinson did this in reverse, just because of the speed of his head turning. We also see what I assume in the background are forward-moving soldiers, looking reversed from our point of view, navigating a sealed-off maze within the Magna Viking that must include normal flowing air. So we come to the day of the 14th. The protagonist lines up with soldiers entering vertical turnstile gears, the proving window being the floor beneath them leading to a red-lit tunnel below. Red light meaning that they would now be going from the blue inverted environment of the rest of the enclosed ship back to the red forward-moving sections of it. I just love the militaristic practicality of this machine. It's a mobile turnstile that allows several individuals to go in at once relatively quickly without breaking a line or having to take a break. Like within a few minutes, you could invert or revert a small army, and that's exactly what they're doing here. And it's all on a mobile warship of a tugboat. Kat asks where Neil is, and the protagonist says he must have gone through already, but the reality is Neil never went through to revert to forward moving on the ship. He just stayed inverting with the blue team and probably is already headed to the Stalsk 12 site. The protagonist wasn't told this because all mission details were compartmentalized by Ives and Wheeler until right before the mission, and weren't even finalized until Wheeler embarked on her inverted team's half of the mission. The protagonist gives Kat a burner phone and tells her that after they succeed, if she ever feels threatened, to call the number on it, state her location and the time, and then hang up.
Who gets the message?
Posterity.
This is the phone that Kat will call on in the final scene when she sees Priya's car, and it's how the protagonist will know to get the jump on Priya and her guy. So giving Kat this phone is kind of a sign of faith by the protagonist that their mission will succeed. As the protagonist flies away from the Magna Viking, he sees some blue containers that were just dropped off on the deck with inverted soldiers reversing back into a container, which means that these guys are exiting from their point of view, and this is some of the soldiers of the blue side of the army returning to the ship after the battle. So the protagonist is curious to see which of them survived and what their injuries look like. Mahir returns to the film to drive Kat's boat to the Vietnam coast, proving he isn't just Neil's guy in Oslo, but rather a utility player within the Tenet organization. In fact, he could be one of the other protagonists that Priya referred to when she said the protagonist was a protagonist. Kat swims back to Sator's yacht to masquerade as a younger self, counting on Sator's oldest self to be doing the same to return to this yacht for his final moments. The protagonist's forward-moving red team gets briefed by Ives, while Wheeler's inverted blue team, who has already gone through this mission from the inverted side, is being debriefed, hidden from our view in these blue containers. The two red soldiers in front of the protagonist mutter that they're not being allowed to see them because their injuries and casualties might scare the red team before their side of the mission. Ives says that the red team's briefing has the benefit of the blue team's experience, meaning before he talked to the red soldiers, he got intel from someone on blue what lies ahead. We intercut to the briefing on the blue side led by Wheeler, seeing Neil listening to it, which happens about an hour into the future, before they moved from the inverted side back through this battle. Wheeler says,
"If you are not at the LZ at 0, you are not leaving."
I think Neil might know deep down that he's never going to make it out of this mission. Meanwhile, Ives explains that part of the red team's job is to clear and cover the landing zone so that blue team can evacuate. He tells his group that there is a turnstile being used by Sator's army so that they're going to be facing a mixture of forward-moving and inverted hostiles and both forward-moving and inverted weaponry. He says that their mission is to stall these defenses just long enough and convincingly fail to defuse the bomb above the hypocenter that's designed to bury the algorithm. Keyword convincingly, because they need to look like they sincerely tried to stop it but just failed, while a sneaky splinter group would sneak in to extract the algorithm, and that's their real mission. But Ives doesn't tell that part to the rest of the group, because no one can know what the real mission is here. Just imagine being a soldier in this army. How many battles have they fought without knowing the true objective of the mission, but just believing in the cause enough to still lay their lives down? Ives tells the protagonist last second that only the two of them are on that splinter team, since no one else in this army is allowed to know what the algorithm even is or what it would look like fully assembled. Rewatching this movie, it's impressive to see how need to know Ives and the Tenet organization are. All information is told at just the precise last second before any operatives would have a chance chance to second guess their plans. Both teams are ferried into Stalsk 12, giving us a look at this city. It's a strip-mined, terraced city with surrealist architecture, something that almost looks like what might have been a city of tomorrow back in the Soviet 70s before it was abandoned. With it all being in brown sand, it's kind of like Nolan pulled some nightmarish concept art from Cobb and Mal's Limbo Dream State in Inception, a place erased from time where the deadliest secrets are buried. They actually shot this battle near Eagle Mountain at Joshua Tree in Southern California at an abandoned mine that actually had many of these existing structures already. The Chinook helicopters carrying the red team land, and immediately the protagonist and his side takes out the anti-aircraft guns, which then leads to the blue containers landing and the inverted team reversing back out. And for the first time, the protagonist and the others get a sense of how wounded the other side is. Then we shift perspective to the blue side, and Ludwig Göransson's music shifts to sound like we're in an inverted vibe. The blue team's landing zone is at the top of this hill above the hypocenter cavern, timing their landing with the detonation. But notice when they approach, especially when you rewatch this, you realize that Neil, Ives, and the protagonist's eventual success is shown right here. You can see a Humvee towing two bodies moving in reverse toward the explosion. We're gonna see later how this will be Neil towing out Ives, the protagonist, and the algorithm. As Neil's inverted blue team moves through this battle, they see the injured red team evacuating at their landing zone. And many of the explosions are reversed in their point of view, but when we cut back to the red team, bigger plumes of smoke are now seen as reversed from their point of view as well, showing that they were being caused by inverted soldiers and inverted artillery. Now there is a crazy moment when the Humvee that was at the top of the blue team's hill when they landed now reverses back down that hill, nearly running over Neil, tripping pedestrian landmines. This we later find out is future forward-moving Neil driving up to the top of this hill, actually helping himself and his blue team by setting off some of these mines. Now back on the yacht, future Satyr and future Cat both pretend to be their younger selves, both trying to fool the other, both trying to act like they're making peace after an argument that would have just happened a few minutes before, when in fact, for them, it was actually several weeks. And the fact that they had some time and some alternate motivations might have been the only reason why any kind of peace happened. Though Satyr does eye Cat curiously when she sits on the cushion. This was where she hid the gun that she's gonna use to kill him. Back in the battle, an inverted protagonist with an RPG reverts a missile back to the 18th floor, which Ives commands to be taken out. But the sprinting the protagonist loves to do in every mission gets the better of him here because he steps on a piece of rubble before he realizes that rubble was wobbling, and the rubble suddenly lifts back upward into an inverted explosion on the building, nearly taking the protagonist upward with it. The protagonist looks overhead and sees an enemy helicopter flying to another block. This is Volkov flying in to place the tripwire at the tunnel entrance, which inverted Neil will later see the reversal of. Neil notices some rubble moving, and he warns Wheeler to get out of an enclosure that they realize is a recently created blast crater. Wheeler escapes, but another blue soldier gets trapped inside the reforming concrete. With the tunnel entrance in sight, the protagonist realizes that they need a distraction to get in without the enemy knowing that they got in, and only now does Ives reveal the master stroke that only Ives and Wheeler knew about and times to occur at the exact midpoint of this 10-minute mission, 5 minutes in. The protagonist sees a collapsed tower whose base has been destroyed beginning to rise back up, and right at 5 minutes, both Ives and Wheeler order to hit the building with RPGs. Forward-moving red side hitting the top floors, inverted blue side hitting the base to give us this movie's second and even crazier Cecil B. DeMille shot. I love this shot so much. You could say it's a pointless spectacle designed to just look cool and show off the inversion effects of this movie, but in the context of the scene, it actually serves a true tactical purpose. It's designed to turn the heads of every soldier nearby in this battle and shadow the entrance of the cave in dust and debris so that no one will see Ives and the protagonist running into this entrance. So to pull off this effect, the set construction crew actually built this tower and many of the buildings of Stalsk 12 to be 30% scale models. They actually built two 1/3 scale models of this building to be exact replicas, one to explode at the base, one to explode at the top of it, and they shot both explosions from the same angles in order to match cut the explosions, showing one forward moving and one reverse, back to back. They also constructed a full-size version of this ruined building so that they could establish the scale by having soldiers running around it. So as Ives and the protagonist run for it, the Humvee appears behind them honking. This of course is future Neil after he reverted to forward moving, trying to warn them about Volkov's tripwire. Meanwhile, back on the yacht, yacht, Sator holds up the CIA poison pill with the silver capsule that I talked about at the top of this video. The pills that we're not sure if they even work or if they're just testing placebos. But if this is Sator, the furthest in the future, he would have gotten this off of one of the Americans tortured in Kiev. Sator says,
The way the world ends. Not with a bang, but a whimper.
He's citing T.S. Eliot's poem The Hollow Men, which Eliot wrote in 1925 to comment on World War I and the lingering psychological impact of the war on the returning soldiers. But the final words of the poem would actually carry much greater meaning after World War II, as a way of suggesting even in a nuclear holocaust, not all of humanity will die in the bang. The last of us will die in a feeble whimper in the winter that follows. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. This is the way the world ends. Not with a bang, but with a whimper. Actually, reportedly, when T.S. Eliot was asked in 1958 if he would write these lines again after the hydrogen bomb had been invented, Eliot said that he would not. Kat flirtingly tells Sator not to take this pill yet, to just keep drinking vodka with her. Now remember, Sator frowned slightly on that phone call to the shore earlier, but now we learn it was because his guy on the other line said Kat was there with Max on the shore, which Sator brings up now, just kind of a little confused and amused, and Kat lowers her head to keep Sator from seeing into her eyes, because as she pointed out to the protagonist earlier, Sator is very good at just noticing little flashes of honesty in Kat's eyes. The protagonist and Ives descend into the hypocenter cavern to find a locked gate with a dead blue soldier on the other side. The protagonist recognizes the coin and thread on his pack, but Volkov appears and knocks Ives out with a shot to the helmet. Neil sees Volkov's tripwire and sprints back to the Stals 12 turnstile. He sees his forward-moving self in the proving window tunnel and sees an opening. Now, as Neil approaches, you can totally see his coin catching the light. This shot comes right after the protagonist finds the dead soldier with the coin, so if you were watching closely the first time, you can totally put it together right here who that soldier is. But now Neil seemingly abandons Wheeler and the others on the blue team to go do this. But he does end up driving the Humvee up the road to detonate mines to help them after they land at the top of the hill. For everything else, he later tells the protagonist this.
Didn't your team need you?
Get him on the next pass.
Volkov hangs a phone receiver for the protagonist to talk to Sator. Sator tells the protagonist that his knowledge will die with him, buried in the tomb like an anonymous Egyptian builder sealed in the pyramid to keep a secret. Then Sator mocks his faith.
Your faith is blind, you're a fanatic.
And he shares with the protagonist what he thinks is a very clear-eyed faith, using imagery as if he's reading from a biblical text.
Somewhere, sometime, a man in a crystalline tower throws a switch, and Armageddon is both triggered and avoided.
Now, in the script, Sator says entropy inverts the same way the magnetic poles have switched 183 times over the millennia. The movie omits that line, but it is true that in the last 83 million years, Earth's magnetic north and south have flipped, seemingly at random, 183 times, which Sator might use to justify simply starting another chron of time for a new era to take over. Nolan might have just left out this bit of geologic history to not get too scientific about it. That's why I think Nolan left out Sator's script lines about the magnetic poles of the planet shifting and the sunset turning into a sunrise, and instead leaves this exchange as a conversation about faith, because Sator says that his greatest sin was bringing a son into the world that he knew was ending, asking if he thinks God would ever forgive him. Nolan also leaves out the very cold scripted follow-up line, "He should understand, he killed his own." Whoa. But the protagonist says Sator doesn't believe in God or anything outside of his own experience.
The rest is belief, and I don't have it.
Without it, you're not human. You're just a madman.
Or a god of sorts.
So here the protagonist states the thematic lesson he has begun to understand in this movie. Humanity's belief in power outside of their own experience is what makes us human. We need faith. If not faith in God, then at least faith in each other. Sator orders Volkov to shoot the protagonist in the head, and he stays on the call just long enough before Kat hangs it up to hear a gunshot, which is what reassures him that all is going according to plan. But it isn't, because that gunshot that was meant for the protagonist instead goes into the dead blue soldier, who rises to absorb the bullet and is now alive again, opening the lock and holding open the gate. Since we now know that this is Neil, anyone looking for clues that Neil is the same person as Max could try to connect some dots between Sator comparing himself to sacrificing his son, to God sacrificing his son Jesus, and a script describing the soldier we later learn is Neil as, quote, risen in this moment. Now, you may ask, if Inverted Neil picked that lock, why was it locked when the protagonist and Ives got to it initially? Well, it's because after Neil took that bullet, he he was no longer able to hold open the gate and it slams shut, reverting to being locked. He needs to physically be holding it open for them to go through. The protagonist shoots Volkov at first in the shoulder, then in the back. They struggle, but the protagonist manages to throw Volkov down the hole and regain control of the capsule, containing the algorithm along with Ives. Kat, meanwhile, squirts some sunscreen on the deck and hoses it and smears some sunscreen on Sator's back to make sure he's gonna slip smoothly off that deck. Unsure of the protagonist's success on his end of the mission, Kat decides to trust her own faith, or at least spend her final moments alive taking control of the moment and revealing her true self to Sator.
And the vengeful bitch you scarred on the outside.
The look Kenneth Branagh brings to Sator's face is the same wide-eyed shock that he gave Inverted, the protagonist, back on the freeway. It's a look that says, "Fuck, someone learned how to play this game better than me." She shoots him and slides him off the deck, and we get a great Titanic propeller blade smack to let us know he did. Neil drops a tow line to Ives and the protagonist in the hypocenter, and he guns it. Boom! They get out of the hole, but they do get initially swallowed in the imploding earth until Neil sees the two of them in the rearview mirror, plus the algorithm, successfully out with no one else in sight and Sator dead, so mission is accomplished. Kat dives off the yacht, closing the loop as she becomes the destined mystery woman that the past version of herself saw. Had that past self not seen that mystery diver, who knows if Kat would have been soured enough on Sator soon enough to give up on their marriage and let the protagonist in at the right time. Again, grandfather paradox, right? Kat and Mahir tow away Sator's body, knowing that they can't let anyone find this corpse and the world needs to think he just disappeared. Ives, the protagonist, and Neil are left with the assembled 9-piece algorithm. This is our first good look at this linear 3D puzzle in the daylight. Altogether, it looks rather like a car's crankshaft, which makes a bit of sense as this algorithm is a kind of component required to keep the internal combustion engine of a future inverted world flowing. What we are really seeing, though, is a physical representation of a mathematical algorithm that can be somehow derived from each of these 9 irregular pieces screwed in the right way with each other that would make this whole thing impossible to copy unless you would be physically holding it all together. And I like that there's a certain analog simplicity to it, but this ugly, clunky design I think is our one clue of what the future of this world really looks like, meaning it's not aspirational or sleek or crystalline as Sator imagined it, but it's just darkly functional, a brutalist tech dystopia. And we find ourselves in something of a Mexican standoff as Ives considers whether to kill the protagonist and Neil for merely seeing the algorithm, but he realizes he can't trust himself 100% better than he could trust in himself plus the protagonist and Neil 33% each, so he splits it up. The implication being, don't ever get too comfortable, don't plan on living a long life where you can grow old and like fall in love and tell some grandkid about this old relic that you have in the closet. No, make yourself hard to find, bury the 3 pieces you have somewhere impossible to find, and then off yourself before you grow too foolish and tell someone, or too vulnerable and let it get tortured out of you. Neil asks the protagonist if he's headed back to London to check on Kat, which the protagonist says is too dangerous even from afar, but I think there's something in Neil's tone that suggests, maybe you should. I think it's another possible clue that he is Max and he grew up with his mom having some mystery guardian angel watching over their backs. Neil reveals that he will be the mystery locksmith who takes the bullet for the protagonist, which the protagonist concludes from the coin on his pack and recalls that this was also the mystery man who saved him back in the Kiev Opera House, his own guardian angel who has been saving him who knows how many times.
It's me in there again, weaving another pass in the fabric of this mission.
The image of weaving a timeline into the fabric of reality, in my headcanon, might be how the protagonist, as the future boss of this Tenet network, derived this gesture as the sign for the organization, because that is what they're all doing. They're making the world safer and more united by stitching together fabric more and more and more in order to keep it from tearing. The protagonist asks if they can change things if they do it differently, but Neil reminds him what's happened's happened.
Which is an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world. It's not an excuse to do nothing.
So we come back to the idea of faith. By naming his lead hero only the protagonist, Christopher Nolan may be referencing one of the most important works in the English language, a play called Everyman that was written sometime in the early 16th century by an anonymous English playwright. It's a morality play that was performed on traveling pageant wagons outside of churches in the Middle Ages, an allegory in which the lead character, named Everyman, is meant to represent how all of humanity should try to live a moral life and avoid sin. Similarly, I think the protagonist's naming choice is meant to be a prescription by Nolan on how to deal with the constant dread that we are living in a twilight world, on the unfortunate side of an open Pandora's box, having to toil and toil to stave off that final sunset by just one more day. Will it be nuclear annihilation? Will it be endless climate crises? How do we proceed knowing that's what's ahead of us? Well, faith that it will all work out, that the fact that we're alive right now means that there's at least hope that we could be living in a happy ending reality, but that faith and hope is not an excuse to do nothing. We have to keep trying to fortify that happy ending and to weave the reality we wish to be living in. And how fitting is it that the gesture for Tenet is also a universal gesture for two hands clasped in prayer? The protagonist realizes that he is the one who recruited Neil when Neil was a younger age. An older version of the protagonist was, and this is something Neil knew the entire time, so that, in a way, both of them recruited each other into this game.
Policy is to suppress.
Whose policy?
Ours, my friend.
And here, Neil brings back that sign of friendship as Nolan references the famous final line of Casablanca.
Louis, I think this is the beginning of a beautiful friendship.
For me, I think this is the end of a beautiful friendship.
The protagonist is only halfway into his friendship with Neil, and there's a whole lifetime of adventures and missions and saves that these two will embark upon. We live in a twilight world, and the protagonist will have faith that what he went through will be the perfect primer for a future partnership. The protagonist began this journey distrusting every player of the game who pops out of a demon door as a demon who needs to be destroyed, but he ends this journey seeing himself a fellow protagonist and every stranger of this game board, someone to trust on faith that they're an angel here to help him. And this notion of an expression of faith in the mechanics of the world, but not an excuse to do nothing, is also a fitting prescription from Christopher Nolan in how to watch this movie. Just have faith in the feeling of it, but also you're gonna have to do some work to get the most out of this. And if you've watched this far into the video, I suspect you're one of those online psychos I've identified so hard with, those of us who have watched Tenet 7 to 8 times, who watched every video analysis, read every subreddit post and thread, because on that 9th watch, you realize, good lord, this is an intricately dense puzzle that does get richer in its complexity, even though I think we should admit this is not that great of a movie, but it remains a brilliant thought experiment that one of the best filmmakers tried to execute using the language of cinema, executed at the highest level of skill by artists at the top of their game. So we return to Neil's lines to the protagonist that was earlier in the drive away from the Oslo airport, a closing monologue that plays over what we see in this final scene.
We're the people saving the world from what might have been. Well, we'll never know what could have happened. And even if they did, they wouldn't care.
I love the idea, by the way, that after Neil and the protagonist clasped hands in that ambulance, Neil just kept going on, waxing poetic about how they're committed to fighting this shadow war that they received no laurels for, the Schrodinger's cats people forgot about, and the speech has echoed in the protagonist's mind throughout his life. The phone that the protagonist gave Kat comes back in this final sequence, this loose end, as Priya tries to kill her outside of Max's school, but the protagonist shows up, killing Priya's assassin, and reminds her what they talked about tying up loose ends, but Priya didn't realize that the superior she was reporting to was a future version of him.
Then you'd better tie up those loose ends.
From saying mission accomplished and earlier telling the others ignorance is our anti-mission, we have seen an evolution throughout this film of the protagonist gradually becoming the true boss of the Tenet organization. Kat walks off with her son Max, and we hear Neil's closing words.
It's the bomb that didn't go off. The danger no one knew was real. That's the bomb with the real power to change the world.
The fact that we are hearing Neil over this shot of Max is, for many, enough proof that Max is the same person as Neil, will grow up to be him, especially if we consider Max's full name could be Maximilian, and the last 4 letters are Neil when you invert them. I don't know if I've ever bought that. For what it's worth, here's what Christopher Nolan has said about the Max equals Neil theories.
I don't allow myself to comment on fan theories anymore. And I made the mistake many years ago and showed Memento with the first ever audience who saw it. And in the press conference afterwards, they asked me about my interpretation of the ending. And I said, well, the important thing is it's ambiguous, it's unknowable, but yeah, what I think is blah, blah, blah. And my brother Jonah took me aside after that and said, you can never do that again. I said, but I said it's ambiguous. He said, no one listened to that. So if you're looking for ambiguity, if you're looking for open possibilities, you have to keep your mouth shut.
And that is why Christopher Nolan will never give us a tease for how to interpret his endings, like the spinning top of Inception or this final shot of Max. So I need to confess to you all now that I started writing this video back in September 2024. From the start of this video to right now, you might be able to see the passage of time on this face. My life, my outlook has changed throughout the course of shooting this. I think I've become a different, maybe a better movie analyzer since the opening minute of this video. I was wiser analyzing the end of this movie than I was the beginning of it. And while doing this, I dragged the deep dive channel to a halt until I could finish this video. So was it worth it to spend over 9 months of my life on what many consider to be the worst Christopher Nolan film? A better question might be, was Tenet worth Christopher Nolan's time? Of course it was. I believe that without Tenet, Nolan never would have made Oppenheimer, never would have made his Oscar winner. Because after he celebrated and praised the World War II generation with his film Dunkirk, Christopher Nolan was clearly wrestling with the great minds of the supposed greatest generation, unable to not hold them accountable for unleashing what might be the inevitable instrument of humanity's destruction. When we watch Tenet, we are seeing a great filmmaker pondering, what if a Cold Era 007 film was instead an espionage thriller of spies trying to undo the Manhattan Project and villains trying to make sure it did happen? And by Oppenheimer Deep Dive, I suggested that the greatest regret of Christopher Nolan's career would be inventing the idea of a billion-dollar superhero movie. He does seem to have issues with the filmmaker he used to be, but in Tenet, I believe he arrives at an answer. I'm only at the beginning of my career, and I cannot change the past. What's happened has happened, but that's not an excuse to do nothing. I must keep toiling to ensure that this world is on the right path. Nolan's version of toiling is making the best films he can possibly make, not taking any shortcuts, inspiring a great crew to meet him at his level, avoiding using CGI, shooting on IMAX film, and showing his work with insane attention to detail that can only be caught by looping back to each scene on future rewatches. And I hope that I have come close to doing the YouTube film analysis equivalent of exactly that in this video. But I didn't do it alone. A team of talented editors and production crew, a company willing to let me spend time doing this, and if you were looking closely, some special help from one particular friend at Dust, who left 9 algorithmic pieces of wisdom to himself, gained only after 9 months of insight. Because my work is only halfway done. Successfully coming to the end of a nearly 2-hour YouTube analysis is not an excuse to do nothing. I see this as the beginning of a beautiful deep dive. Because he doesn't have faith yet! Destiny demon magic! Because they have no other choice! It would just break everything! It goes in the backseat of the Saab! Yes, but they have to make sure that happens! He was the only man for that job! Christopher Nolan got bored with Bond movies! Maybe, but thanks for watching.